I love connecting family members in more than one way. Having Doris get together with Marshall meant that Luke became his brother-in-law. But wouldn't it be fun if there was another connection in the family? And so that's why I created Judith. I wanted her to be a bit of a fish out of water, brought from high society New York to flee the shame that came from their father breaking the law and going to prison and having to adjust to the small Wyoming town in 1905, how to fix this, how to make a life for herself and adjust. And her journey, I thought, was a fun one. Not an easy one, but it was good that even though Luke is a ranch owner, and he's definitely a rancher, he works hard, just like Judith's brother does. He was also raised in that higher society life, though his was in Indianapolis. But it's not like he was completely alien to the worlds he grew up in. So I think it made it fun as the two came together and had to find a way to make it all work. Enjoy.
A Lady for Luke, Lilac City novella series, written by Donna K. Weaver, narrated by Vicki Pierce. Chapter 1. As Luke Hamblin stepped out of the bunkhouse door, the biting wind shoved him back with a hard thud. Drat the weather. "I'm all right," he called to his housekeeper before she or any of the hands came out to investigate the noise. He stepped away from the building. Another gust hit, forcing him to put both hands on his new Stetson. Severe cold coming in late November didn't bode well for the winter. As though the weather had heard his thought, a snowflake smacked his face. A big, fat one. It was a good thing his Thanksgiving company had already arrived. They might need to stay the night. Still, holding his hat, Luke ran for the main house. As he opened the door, another blast of wind hit, rattling the shutters and ripping the door from his grasp. He scrambled to catch it, a tinge of worry for his cattle increasing his unease. It was a good thing they'd already culled the herd. Luke hung up his heavy coat and hat. He followed the sound of voices to the dining room. When he entered the room, a cozy scene greeted him, pushing back his previous concerns about the weather. This time last year, it'd been his housekeeper, foreman, and their children who'd shared their meal with him. For the first time in almost 10 years, he was spending the holiday with his family. Having them around him was something Luke would be forever grateful for. He swallowed around the lump in his throat. "Here's Luke now," Charles Merrick said from where he stood by the fireplace with Marshall Breckinridge. Unable to keep back a grin, Luke joined his new brothers-in-law, saying, "What disagreement do you need me to settle this time?" "I wouldn't rightly call it a disagreement," Charles, the peacekeeper, said. That was one of the things that made him such a good deputy sheriff for the little town of Lilac City. He had a way of smooth-talking folks, unlike the sheriff with his brusquer manner. "I would definitely call it a disagreement." Marshall crossed his arms and leaned against the mantel. The hint of a smirk in his expression told Luke what was going on. The man was once again egging on Charles, who'd inherited a stud farm from his grandfather back east and was planning to ship the herd to Wyoming in the spring. Marshall enjoyed giving useful advice, but also offering dire predictions. Charles had been dismayed to discover he'd have to expand his herd to more than only his grandfather's hot-headed thoroughbreds if he meant to sell stud services to Western ranchers. One of Luke's cowhands stood to the side, looking very much like he wanted to say something. Nick was probably too intimidated to speak up. The young man regularly ate with the family, instead of in the bunkhouse with the rest of the men, at the special invitation of Luke's youngest sister. The 23-year-old man had come to Wyoming earlier that year from a ranch in Texas, and often had good suggestions. "What have you got to say, Nick?" Luke asked, curious. Startled, the young man's face flushed. He glanced to the side as though he searched for a quick getaway. "No, you're not going to escape." Luke grabbed his sleeve and pulled him over. "You should tell my brothers-in-law what you're thinking." "Well, you remember I grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas." When all three men nodded, Nick shifted uncomfortably. "I'd be interested to know how you might do things differently there than we do here, in Wyoming." Marshall said, the teasing now gone. There was a good reason he was so successful as the owner of a working dude ranch. "It's not that y'all do things so different, but that we have some breeds I ain't seen here." Nick shoved his hands in his pockets, once again looking as though he'd prefer to be somewhere else. "Such as?" Luke encouraged. "Have you ever heard of a steel dust?" "Yes," Luke and Marshall said at the same time. "A what?" Charles asked. "Go ahead and explain," Luke said with a nod. "It's a breed of quarter horse. Comes from a horse by the same name." Nick seemed to relax as he warmed to the topic. "They got small ears, a big jaw, and are heavy muscled. They're right smart and run like lightning in a quarter-mile race. It's the only breed my pa will have on his ranch. We usually just call them cow horses because they've got an instinct about cattle. So if you're looking to breed good horses for ranch use, Deputy Merrick, you might want to consider a steel dust." "Well, I'll look into them. They might be just what I need." Charles rubbed the back of his neck, glancing toward the door to the kitchen, where he could hear the womenfolk talking and laughing. "It's been a disappointment to discover what my grandfather spent his whole life building isn't a great fit out here. I'll have to stay on as deputy longer than I hoped." "The sheriff will be glad, even if your wife isn't." Marshall clapped Charles on the back. "Says the man whose new bride is perfectly happy with his job," Luke said. "Who's not happy with your job?" Frances said, striding into the room. Nick looked relieved she'd finally joined them and moved to stand by her. "Have you snuck out of the kitchen again?" Luke asked his youngest sister. "Hey, I did my share." She crossed her arms and leaned toward Nick, who'd taken a matching position, so their stances were like a mirror image. If it hadn't been so obvious she had no romantic interest in the young man, Luke might have been nervous. His three half-sisters, upon the death of their father, had fled to Luke to escape marriages arranged by their uncle. Luke had been glad to finally have family around him again, but two of the girls had already made matches of their own, to Charles and Marshall. Luke wasn't in a hurry for Frances to leave his home, too. "I'll have you know I peeled every one of the potatoes you'll be eating today," Frances sniffed. "How come you men don't get stuck in the kitchen like the women?" "If you really believe my lovely Doris would have preferred to be out with me and my men this morning, feeding the herd," Marshall dragged out the last word for emphasis. "That's right. Mention the Lancaster sister who's the least willing to get dirty." Frances straightened. "I've been sent out here to see that you men set the table right. Now, let's get busy." "She's going to lead a man a fine dance someday," Charles said, his voice low. That she was. Luke glanced at Marshall and wondered how the man was doing with his own sister challenges. Judith had come to Wyoming to serve as his hostess and help with Marshall's young daughters. Now he'd remarried. He had 2 adult women to keep happy. While Luke found Judith intriguing, she had a disdainful air about her that would put off any man. It sure had kept him from inviting her to go for a buggy ride with him, in spite of how often he'd thought about asking her. With her being his sort of sister-in-law now, it might make family gatherings like this one awkward if she were to turn him down. "How's everyone settling in?" Luke asked. "You mean between Doris and my sister?" There was an encouraging touch of humor in Marshall's question. "Well, if anyone can get along with another woman under the same roof, it'd be my sister." "True that." Marshall let out a breath. "I'll be glad when Judith is settled in a home of her own. She was just beginning to find her way as my hostess. She's made every effort to welcome Doris as my wife, but there are still awkward moments on occasion. My sister looks lost again, the way she did when she first came to me. I haven't mentioned this before, but now we're family, I feel I can. Her fiancé broke off their engagement after our father was convicted." Luke hadn't known that particular detail, surprised at a powerful urge to smash her fiancé's face for hurting her. No wonder the beautiful woman could be so waspish. "Hey, you two slackers," Frances called. "Get your lazy hides over here. There's work to do." Luke exchanged an amused glance with Marshall, and the two men headed to join Charles. Frances brooked no nonsense from any man. Judith Breckinridge worked quietly with the other women as they put the final touches on the Thanksgiving dinner. At this time last year, her maid had been dressing Judith's hair in preparation for the Harrison ball. Later in the evening, she'd stood with Teddy to greet his family's guests, her mind full of what their life would be like once they'd married. Not anymore. Now she was only good for common labor as a kitchen drudge. The bitterness of the thought tasted like bile. How far she'd fallen in a year. "Thank you so much for helping," Doris said, pulling Judith into one of her spontaneous hugs. "Wasn't it brave of Mrs. McDaniel to let us cook such a big meal?" Judith had wondered where the Lucky L's notable housekeeper and cook was. Doris must have seen Judith's confusion because she said, "She gave us the recipes and helped us, but she's overseeing the dinner for the hands while we finish up. I hope we can host it at the Circle B next year." Doris's cheeks flushed with happiness. "That would be wonderful." Judith tried not to sound bitter. Blinking back tears, she turned to the oven and pulled out a pan of dinner rolls. She'd never considered herself petty, but each day she was finding it more difficult not to resent the happiness surrounding her. It was unfair. She'd done nothing to shame her family, yet she carried the burden. Here in Wyoming, Marshall had been far removed from the scandal and seemed barely touched by it. But it was different for a woman, and Judith had been forced to live through all of it. What man would ever look at the daughter of a convicted felon as a possible wife? Lilac City had many more men than women, but most of the men were dirty, uneducated cowboys and other unsavory types suited to the young women who arrived every month to work in the hotel serving the railway passengers. Judith had even heard a rumor some men were talking about mail-order brides. That was one thing she and Frances agreed on. It was outrageous to order a wife like one did seeds from a catalog. "We did it," Maud cried as she and Doris removed a roasting pan with a huge turkey from the other oven and set it on the big work table. "Wouldn't Father be pleased to know how accomplished we've become? I hope he'd be proud of us." Doris took the corner of her apron and dabbed at her eyes. A sense of shame flooded Judith. Truly, what was she becoming to resent the hard-won happiness these two sisters had found here? 9 months ago, they buried their beloved father and then been forced to flee an outrageous demand from their uncle. They'd had to escape 2 attempts to force them to return. Judith was not the only one who'd suffered at the hands of a family member. She would not resent the happiness of the Lancaster sisters. Once the three of them had moved the bird to a large platter, Judith moved to the dining room door and opened it. As always, her eyes searched for Luke. He stood laughing with the men, handsome in a rugged, wind-blown way she would never have thought appealing a year ago. When he glanced her way, she dropped her gaze. "Would one of you men like to carry in this giant bird?" she asked. "I believe that's my job." Luke grinned, unable to shake the feeling he'd finally come into his own, and trotted into the kitchen. "Holy smoke, girls! This looks delicious." He picked up the platter and went to the door where Judith held it open. Luke leaned against it, so she didn't have to. "After you, my lady," he said with an exaggerated bow. At her blink of surprise and the way her cheeks colored, Luke's own face warmed. Dang, but he liked it when she went all shy. He'd only seen her do it a couple of times. "I need to get the mashed potatoes." She didn't look at him as she returned to the kitchen. Why would a beautiful and elegant woman like Judith Breckinridge respond with surprise at such a small gesture? Something in her eyes had reminded him of Gypsy. He'd bought the horse a few years back, liking her dark bay color. If he'd checked her closer like he should have, he'd have known how badly she'd been handled. He wouldn't have bought her and missed out on owning one of the finest mares in the county. "You just going to stand there and tease us with the smell?" Marshall asked with a grin. Feeling foolish at being caught daydreaming, Luke gave an embarrassed chuckle. The ladies followed him into the room, handing off serving dishes to the men before returning for more. As he set the platter in the middle, his gaze followed Judith. Was she so prickly because of how she'd been cast aside by that fiancé of hers? "Luke, I'm grateful to finally get to share this holiday with you again." Maud watched him with glistening eyes that made a lump form in his throat. He'd missed his sisters a lot over the years. "Me too," Doris said, tears running down her cheeks. Marshall brought her hand to his lips and kissed it before offering her his handkerchief. "Well, I am too," Frances said, her voice rougher than usual. "But don't expect me to go all sappy about it." She pointed to the turkey. "Who's going to carve it?" "Since this is my house, I get that honor too." Luke was about to pick up the knife when he remembered the blessing. He extended his arms to each side and took Maud's and then Judith's hands. At her touch, an unexpected tingle ran up his arm, and her fingers twitched. When the others had clasped hands, Luke offered a simple prayer of gratitude for having family around again and for the Lord's blessing of prosperity. After he'd said Amen, he was slow to release Judith's hand. Since the wedding, she'd let some of her superior attitude slip. Luke couldn't shake the idea the young woman needed the same kind of tender care his horse had. She shot him a wary sidelong glance. He released her hand and picked up the carving knife. Yes, beside him sat a wounded soul. If she'd let him, he'd do whatever he could to help her heal it. Chapter 2. "We should take advantage of the program the school is putting on for Christmas," Judith said to the members of the Ladies' Improvement Society. She hadn't been one of the founding members, but as soon as she'd heard about it from Doris, Judith had joined. If she were to be forever ostracized from polite society back home, she would do what she could to bring culture and refinement to Lilac City. The meetings at the hotel on Saturday mornings made her feel she was doing something productive and worthwhile. "What do you have in mind?" Mary Teague asked. While she hadn't been a member of the upper crust in her hometown and would never have run in the same circles as Judith, the woman came from an affluent family and had received a decent education. Besides the two older Lancaster sisters, Mary was the woman most likely to support anything Judith suggested. Doris has her scholars working on a display of talents as well as a presentation of the Christmas story, Judith said, scanning her list. Oh, do you like my idea? Her sister-in-law flushed prettily, looking happy at the recognition. Of course I do, Judith said. Doris's addition to the Circle B household had been a relatively easy one. Judith had never before met anyone she wanted to please so much. It was a gift Marshall's bride had. Judith had found she resented it, which, she had to remind herself, was catty. Even the need to remind herself of that was a new thing, since all her friends in New York had treated each other that way. Gentle and kind Doris deserved better treatment, which brought out a protective side to Judith she hadn't known she had. If we were also to invite adults to submit items for display or performance, Judith said, we could fill the hall and turn it into a true community event. What kinds of talents do you think adults would offer? Mrs. Phelps, the mayor's wife, asked. For one, Doris can display some of her artwork. Judith ignored the look of alarm that flashed across her sister-in-law's face. She had a rare talent in painting, and Judith refused to let the young woman hide her light under a bushel. I've also seen some beautiful sketches done by Mr. McDaniel. Tom? Edith Vosberg, the sheriff's sister, asked in surprise. She was another woman who was most likely to support any effort to civilize Lilac City. She'd once confided to Judith the sheriff had refused to let her come to keep house for him until the church had been built. He hadn't considered it a fit place for a decent woman until then. Yes, Tom, Judith said. And from what Mrs. McDaniel says, there are several hands at the Lucky L Ranch who like to sketch. I've asked around at the Circle B, and it appears there are a few there, too. I like the idea, Mary Teague said, looking thoughtful. But could we expand on it? One of our goals is to bring culture to Lilac City, but we can't do that unless we involve more than the people who already have some culture. We need something that will bring in the cowhands, Maud said. It took all Judith's restraint not to make a face at the suggestion. Yes, she'd asked around about cowboy artists, but once she'd returned home after speaking to some of them, she'd had to call for bathwater. It hadn't even been that the men had been overly dirty or stank. They did hard work outside, after all. There'd simply been something so raw about the men that it had frightened her. The men who worked her brother's ranch had the same sense of power about them that Luke Hamblin's men did. If she were to look closely at the cowhands in town, she was sure they'd have it as well. It made the sophisticated men back home seem weak, which wasn't a comparison she was comfortable making. Did all men have that raw edge about them? She saw it sometimes in Marshall, but her brother had managed to hold on to his finer qualities. Did the roughness of this life rub away at the refinement men wore, like they did a finely tailored jacket? Was sophistication and elegance only an illusion? Once it was stripped from men, were they all like the cowhands? Surely not her brother. Or Luke Hamblin. What do you think, Judith? Maud asked. She startled, as much from her uncomfortable ruminations as being pulled from them. I'm sorry, Judith said. I must have been wool-gathering. Anyone in particular? Mary teased. Judith flushed, looking down at her list. Why was she coloring like a schoolgirl over a man who'd called her his new sister? She refused to have feelings for Luke Hamblin. Don't tease her. Doris gave Judith's hand a sympathetic pat. What did I miss? She asked, all business. Edith says we ought to include the Christmas turkey shoot in our talent contest, Maud said. It's not a contest, Judith argued. It'll bring in the cowhands. If you're going to feed them culture, we have to include a dish of something they enjoy. Men are competitive. Am I right? Edith glanced around the table. Always listen to my sister, Abe Vosberg said from the doorway. Judith pursed her lips. The man knew this was a private meeting. She'd chided him about peeking in more than once. "Oh, come join us, Sheriff," Mary Teague said, waving him to the empty chair beside her. "We could use some input from a man." Judith was about to protest when her brother and Luke Hamblin came to stand beside the sheriff. "They want my input," the older man said with a smug grin. "Why don't you all come in?" Maud asked. Doris was already scooting over to make room for Marshall. He didn't hesitate to grab a chair from the wall. That left the only other empty seat beside Judith. "This is the Ladies' Improvement Society," she huffed, trying not to look at Luke as he sat. "We're not asking to join," he said. "What is it you need masculine input on? You ladies have already shown yourselves to be queens of organization." "That's all Judith," Maud said. "She has an amazing memory for details." "What are you planning?" Marshall asked, looking ridiculously happy with his arm around Doris. Judith shot a sidelong glance at Luke. What would it be like to have him put his arm around her? A powerful sense of longing hit her, making it impossible to speak. Then she noticed Edith watching, the corner of her mouth quirking up. How humiliating. The woman was probably 40 and seemed completely satisfied with being a spinster. "Let me explain what we'd like to do," Edith said, her expression now sympathetic. Judith dropped her gaze to the table, forcing herself to take slow, deep breaths. What was wrong with her? It had begun with Maud's marriage, followed a few weeks later by Doris's. Judith had pushed her brother to pursue his interest in the sweet beauty. But never had Judith dreamed it would drive home what she could not have for herself. As Luke listened to Edith Vosberg review their ideas, he still couldn't shake the sense that Judith was hurting. Her discomfort was almost palpable to him, and perhaps anyone who bothered to look at her. Since he'd first compared her to Gypsy, he must never let the beautiful Judith learn he'd thought of her in terms of a horse. Luke had remembered other occasions where he'd thought she was being snooty, but now recognized as protecting herself. Ever since she'd stepped off the train, her rigid posture and raised chin had given him the impression she considered herself above him. And people in town had thought the same thing. It reminded him of the tea at the Circle B that he'd taken Doris to last summer. It had been the first one Judith had held, and she'd invited Doris to help her serve. Luke had meant to drop off his sister and then leave, but something had prompted him to go inside. As Judith had taken her seat to begin serving tea, he'd been drawn to her table. At the time, he'd wondered if he liked the pain of her condescension. While sitting stiffly straight and tense, she'd been surprisingly gracious, contrary to the shrewish way she usually behaved. Once he'd accepted a cup of tea and not had his head bitten off, a few other men had braved speaking with her, and she'd visibly relaxed. Judith Breckinridge was a confusing woman. "So," Edith said, finishing, "we're looking at talents the men would like to take part in or watch." "In trade for sitting quietly for your more refined activities?" Abe asked. "That's quite a trade, Sheriff," Marshall said, grinning when Doris elbowed him. "But what's to keep the men from leaving before the more genteel activities?" "Have the turkey shoot be the last of the outdoor events," Luke said. "Open with rope tricks and mix in some cowboy poetry in between the musical performances." "I like it," Mary cried. "Cowboy Poetry? Judith sounded like she was trying not to let her sarcastic side show, but she failed. Irritated, Luke shifted in his seat to look at her. You assume creativity is limited to people back east who get to attend fancy schools. My men spend a lot of time in the saddle. They find interesting ways to pass the time, including music and verse. Doris told me you've been searching out their sketches for your art gallery. I'm surprised you'd assume they're all a bunch of know-nothings. Maud coughed. Sorry, he muttered to Judith. My apology, she said, stiff again, her face pale. It's a shame you don't own a piano, Luke, Maud said. We might have been able to convince Frances to play. Oh, I miss hearing her beautiful music, Doris said, her voice wistful. Frances plays the piano? Luke felt stupid for not knowing that. Doris may be a gifted painter, Maud said, but Frances creates magic on a keyboard. She's so passionate it comes through the music she plays. Just before Father died, he'd arranged for her to enroll at Dr. Domrosch's new school he opened this year in New York. He's the godson of Franz Liszt and doesn't believe Americans should have to travel abroad for advanced music study. Then Father died, and her hopes came crashing down, Doris sniffed. Aren't there any pianos in Lilac City? Luke asked. Besides the honky-tonk in the saloon? Abe asked. And the pump organ in the church, Edith added. Frances had a Steinway back home, Maud said. I hate to think of that beautiful grand piano under a dust cover, Doris sighed. I'm sorry, Maud said. I didn't mean to distract from the conversation. What else should we consider for the program? How about tall tales? Abe asked. Oh, yes. We should include a tall tale competition. Edith gave her brother a nudge with her shoulder. This big lug has a few that would curl your toes. While the others moved on to discuss the order of the program to encourage the most people to stay for the day, Luke made a mental note to look for a piano. He glanced at Judith. What could he say to smooth things between himself and her? They were family now, after all. He'd waited too long to have one again, and he didn't want to be the cause of any awkwardness at family gatherings, to say nothing of his wish to convince this woman to let him take her out for a ride. Well, I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time to help us with this, Maud said, rising. This could be the start of a new holiday tradition for Lilac City. The others stood and began to leave the room. Judith took her time stacking her notes and putting them in her bag. Luke, I'm going to take my lovely wife to lunch. Charles is meeting us in the dining room here, Marshall said, giving his sister a concerned glance. Would you allow me to buy you lunch? Luke asked Judith, standing beside her. She jerked her head up to look at him, her eyes wide. Then she dropped her gaze. I must go through my notes, please. Luke held out his hand to her. At first he thought she wouldn't take it. Then with a sigh, she placed her hand in his and graciously rose. She truly had an elegance about her that seemed out of place in rough-and-tumble Lilac City. Perhaps the program would help her to see the people as more than their circumstances. Judith's hand trembled a little as she accepted Luke's. Why would he be kind after chastising her for mocking his cowhands? And he'd had every right to do it. She hadn't meant to be demeaning in her comment, even though her words and tone had reflected her thoughts. Tom told me you've come to their house more than once to see his sketches, Luke said as they walked to the main dining room. Yes, Judith said, aware of the interested looks directed at them by the locals. What were they imagining? That the handsome Lucky L ranch owner had taken pity on his new spinster sister-in-law and was paying some attention to her out of pity? That's all you have to say about it? He asked. Judith glanced at him. wondering what he wanted her to say. He didn't approve when she spoke her mind, though in the case of Tom McDaniel, there was nothing but positive things to say. The man has a gift for capturing men and animals in motion. It's my opinion he could compete with the likes of Frederick Remington and C.M. Russell. "Did you mention it to him?" Luke asked as he pulled out a chair for her at the same table as his sisters. "I did. He didn't believe me." Judith sat and adjusted her skirts. "I've ordered some watercolors for him." Luke paused, his hand on his chair back, and then slowly took the seat. His look of surprise embarrassed and shamed Judith. Did he see her as having no womanly feelings? It was her own fault if he did. Her bitterness escaped at the most awkward moments, usually in front of other people. "You ordered watercolors for my foreman?" Luke's soft words were wary, as though he thought she might be preparing to mock him for believing she would do such a thing. How could she explain to him, or anyone, how confused she was? The people she was being forced to associate with, for the most part, were from the lowest rungs of society. They were people she had always been protected from. Until she'd come to Lilac City, the servants in the homes and social gatherings she'd visited were the only people she'd spoken with whom actually labored with their hands. All her life, she'd been taught those people were little more than intelligent apes, trained to take care of menial tasks. Judith had accepted it as the truth. The little glimpses into the lives of these lowly laborers were showing her it was not the case, and she had no idea how to cope with it. All she'd been able to cling to since her father's shameful behavior had been the knowledge she was something special, a member of a class above most people. If it weren't true, she would not consider it. "Yes, I did," Judith said, slowly opening her napkin and spreading it over her lap. "I wished to see if, by adding color to some of his works, he might increase their value and make them worthy to display in the gallery." It wasn't true, but admitting how talented the man was seemed an admission she wasn't ready to make. Luke had that pinched expression again, his disapproval strong. She should never have agreed to come to lunch. Judith moved her napkin to the table and rose. "I really do need to get to work on the schedule for the Christmas event we discussed this morning." Before anyone could argue with her, she grabbed her bag and turned away. "What did you say to her, Luke?" Marshall was asking as she hurried to the entrance. "I didn't say anything." Chapter 3. "Come on in," Tom McDaniel called at Luke's knock. He stomped his feet to shake off the snow and entered his foreman's house. "Got a package for you." Luke handed over the parcel with a New York postmark. In the week since Judith's disclosure, he'd made sure to be the one who rode into town every day to pick up the mail. "What is it?" the older man asked. "I'm not expecting anything." "Well, open it and find out." Luke crossed his arms and tried not to look too interested. There had been a false note to the disparaging comment Judith had said about Tom's art needing watercolors. Why would she tell a lie to be mean? Tom tore the wrapping from the carton. He lifted the lid, and both he and Luke leaned closer to see the contents. Tom glanced up and said, "Do you mind? You're blocking the light." "Sorry." Chuckling, Luke shifted his angle but didn't step away. Tom removed a book that had been on top of a wooden box with a shiny veneer. He carefully removed it from the carton and lifted the brass latch holding it closed. Inside were slots that held small colored blocks labeled with names like vermilion, indigo, sienna, and yellow ochre. The label on the inside of the lid said Color Box and had been crafted by Reeves and Sons in London. With a surprised expression, Tom said, This must have cost as much as I make in a year. Why would anyone send me something like this?" A sudden rush of pride flowed through Luke. Judith had only ordered a few watercolors, had she? "What do you know? There are paintbrushes in the drawer underneath." Tom picked up one and ran his fingers over it. He handed it to Luke. "These must be made of mink or sable." He ran the soft bristles over his cheek before handing it back. "That first chamber is deeper than what's holding those paints. See if it comes out." With great care, Tom clasped the edges of the wood and lifted it to expose a porcelain platter divided into 4 sections. One end of the dish was perhaps an inch deep, while the other end was quite shallow. "What's that for?" Luke asked. "I've seen one of these before up in Billings a couple of years ago. You put water in the deep end to mix watercolors to the intensity you want." Tom heaved out a breath. "I can't accept this. It's too expensive." Luke had been about to tell him Judith had sent it to him, but his foreman's comment stopped the words. She considered Tom's sketches good enough to justify an expensive purchase like this. Luke would have to warn her not to say anything, or the man would for sure give them back, though she probably wasn't planning to admit to the gift anyway. "Are you going to send it back?" Luke asked. "Good question." Tom picked up the paper wrapping and scanned it. "There's no return address." "Well, my suggestion is to not look a gift horse in the mouth." Tom scowled, but it was obvious from his expression he was loath to give it back, in spite of what he thought. "I wonder what one of your sketches would look like colored with these," Luke said, going to stand by one of the framed pictures on the wall. "I'd want to paint some practice sketches first. Martha would kill me if I ruined one of those by painting them wrong." Tom studied the pictures, his expression contemplative. "Well, you'll want to make sure you have plenty of paper then." "You really have no idea who sent this?" Tom asked, a crease between his brows. "I just pick up the mail. I'd best head to the house. Maud and Charles are coming for dinner. You don't want to be late either." Luke didn't wait for his foreman to say anything else, but left the house. Standing on the porch for a second, Luke braced himself against the cold as he scanned the white landscape. His thoughts drifted back to the box of watercolors. That Judith Breckinridge was a pistol. There was certainly more to her than met the eye. "I'll just get a bite to eat here with Mrs. Hauser," Judith said to her niece. "Oh, please come." 5-year-old Lydia had taken her hand and was now wearing one of her pleading expressions. "I love having so many aunties now. Frances makes me laugh. I want to be just like her when I grow up." Judith straightened. The child could not have said anything more likely to convince Judith to attend. She would not allow Marshall's delightful daughters to be influenced by that wild woman. Luke's youngest sister spent her time with the men, riding with them, herding cattle, and had even led tours for the Dude Ranch guests last summer. It was outrageous, and Judith had no intention of allowing Frances to be a negative influence. "I will come."
"Oh, thank you."
"So, my little sugar pie, you did it," Marshall said from the doorway. Lydia spun around.
"I told Mama Doris I could talk her into coming, and I was right."
He scooped her up and blew on her belly, making her squeal with delight. Judith refrained from huffing, as she would have done when she'd first arrived. Whenever her brother interacted with his daughters, he forgot he was a man of dignity, a prosperous landowner, a Breckinridge of New York City. He would have nothing of her reprimands, and she was slowly coming to appreciate the difference in the atmosphere in his home compared to the home of their youth. Was living in Lilac City going to tear down all her beliefs? Would the day come when Judith would don split skirts and go riding with the men like Frances? "Let me get my hat and coat," Judith said. Except for church, she hadn't seen Luke Hamblin since the disastrous lunch. She made sure not to look at him, and he made no effort to get her attention. Why had she spoken so disparagingly of Tom McDaniel's artwork? The man was truly gifted. It was almost as though she wanted people to assume the worst about her. "I'm so glad Lydia was able to talk you into coming," Doris said, giving Judith a quick hug. "Wait, Florence! Your hat isn't tied right, and your ears will freeze." While the others chattered happily, Judith sat in the back of the sleigh with her nieces, making changes to her mental list of things needed for the Christmas fair, which the school children had begun to call it. Marshall had been able to help with a few scheduling questions she'd had since they'd made the initial list. She wasn't sure how to move from the more boisterous activities into a reverent telling of the Christmas story by the children at the end. When the sleigh came to a stop in front of the Hamblin home, Judith was pulled from her musings. She actually found it quite an attractive house. It was more rustic than Marshall's, though the difference was a subtle one. Both suited their purposes, however, as they also served as the lodging for the Dude Ranch guests during the summer. "Let me give you a hand," Luke said when Judith stood and prepared to step from the sleigh. She hesitated only a second before taking his offered hand, and she didn't pull back when he tucked her hand in his arm. He patted it, his expression full of approval. The complete contrast to his response at the hotel made her wary. "That was a wonderful thing you did for Tom," Luke said. "I've never seen the man so excited, and adding a book of instructions on watercolor painting was perfect. Thank you." Judith stared into his dark eyes. Never in her life had a man looked at her with such admiration. It would be easy for her to lose herself in them. She was suddenly aware, as she had been the day of her brother's wedding to Doris, of how attractive he was. Judith wondered again what it would be like to be kissed by him. "I'd like to talk with you about it," Luke said, his voice low, "when we have some time." She blinked. He couldn't mean the kiss she'd been imagining. Judith's chest tightened. Of course not. Only in her dreams would this man ever consider kissing her. "I don't know what you mean," she said. They'd reached the house. Judith released his arm and stepped forward to greet Maud and Charles. "Well, get inside and shut the door," Mrs. McDaniel called from inside. "You'll freeze us out." Everyone did as she bade, and in the chaos that followed, Judith made sure to keep far away from Luke Hamblin. Once she'd removed her coat and hat, she hurried over to Mrs. McDaniel to assist with putting the final touches on the table. "It smells wonderful," Judith said to the housekeeper. "My brother mentions often how he's tried several times to steal you away from the Lucky L." "As if I'd be likely to jump ship when Luke Hamblin's been like one of my boys." The plump woman chuckled. "You don't abandon family. For too many years, we were all he had." The others had entered the dining room, so Judith didn't say anything more. The housekeeper's comment stayed with Judith as she moved to take a seat at the table. "Here, Judith," Luke said, pulling out a chair near the end and indicating she should sit there. Chagrined to find it was the chair on his right, she paused. Not wanting to draw attention to herself, she took it. Having spent so much time out here in the wilderness, had he forgotten the significance of placing her in the seat of the guest of honor? Her brother wouldn't have missed it, but she dared not glance his way. "I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for supper tonight. It's actually a celebratory meal." Luke glanced at Charles expectantly, and the man gave a little nod as he took his wife's hand. Luke said, his chest puffing, "I'm finally going to be an uncle." The adults offered congratulations while Maud's face turned a bright red. "Are you going to write to Aunt Hortense about this?" Doris asked. "I think you should." But what about me? 6-year-old Florence asked, tugging on Luke's sleeve and pulling him from the conversation. And me? Aren't you our uncle? Lydia's sweet little face grew confused and her eyes filled with tears. Don't we count? Realizing what he'd done and not knowing how to fix it, Luke shot Judith a terrified glance. My guess is he meant he would be an uncle again, Judith said. You have to remember, he's still getting used to being an uncle at all. Exactly so. Luke gave each of them a quick hug. It's a great honor to have such lovely young ladies be my nieces. And what good examples you can be to your cousins. Both the little girls grinned happily. Whoa, Luke said softly, leaning closer to Judith. That was a close call. Thanks for coming to my rescue. There was something endearing about a man who cared about the feelings of little girls. Her father never had. You're doing remarkably well, considering how changed your life is, Judith said. Do you ever compare the beginning of this year to now? Every day. Luke's throat worked. It took a minute before he could speak again. The good Lord's blessed me this year, beyond anything I could have dreamed. I'm sorry it's at the expense of my sisters losing their father, but I'm still grateful they came to me. Judith nodded, wishing she could tell him how much he impressed her. Unlike Luke with his sisters, Marshall hadn't been pleased when she'd arrived at the Circle B. He was a gentleman, however, and just like when their cousin Edgar had arrived last fall, her brother had made her welcome anyway. Their first few weeks had been rocky, and she had no one to blame but herself. After having associated with the kind-hearted Doris for so long now, Judith found herself looking back on her immature behavior with dismay. She was trying to do better, but it was more difficult than she would have expected. What was she to do when her deepest desire was to be in New York, once again secure in her status as a lady of substance? She'd grown weary of praying for God's mercy, and he had surely tired of her pleas for her old life. Not that she'd take Teddy back, the snake. Does something not taste right? Luke asked softly, watching her with concern. Judith blinked, caught in unhappy daydreams again. The food is delicious. Why do you ask? Because you made a face like you'd bit into something bitter. I was merely thinking. She picked up her glass and took a sip. Luke waited until she put it down before saying, A penny for your thoughts, then. Judith's heart gave a little lurch. She rarely spoke of personal things, and certainly not with a man, not even Teddy. The weight of all she'd lost that year struck her forcefully, causing her eyes to burn. She dropped her gaze, lest the handsome rancher see her distressed. I'm sorry, Judith. Luke covered her hand with his, causing her to meet his gaze. It's only been recently I've realized how much you've been hurt. Her shoulders hunched. It made her father's behavior real whenever it was spoken of aloud. The tingle of his lingering touch provided a mild distraction, but she didn't want pity from Luke. She wanted his regard, and not as a sister. Haven't we all been hurt at one time or another? Judith asked, stiffening as she had learned to do to protect herself. It cannot have been an easy thing for you to be cast out of your mother's home. A flash of hurt crossed his face, and his hand on hers twitched. When he moved it, she especially regretted her attempt to shift the topic of conversation. Why must everything she said or did go wrong? She hadn't used to be so socially inept. Luke didn't speak to her for the rest of the meal. Chapter 4. In order for us to pull our fare together in time, Mary Teague said at the beginning of the next Ladies' Improvement Society meeting, we're going to need to bring in a man to help us with their events. While the other ladies offered differing opinions on the statement, Judith sat silently in her seat. She might have known bringing in the men last week would result in something like this. So much for the Ladies' Improvement Society. What was it going to be now? The Lilac City Improvement Society? It might have a nice ring to it, but she would hate to see the ladies surrender their autonomy to be railroaded by pushy men. In her experience, members of the male sex always assumed they knew best about everything. "Who did you have in mind?" Judith asked during a lull in the conversation. "It can't be Charles," Maud said. "Or the sheriff," Edith added. "With winter coming early this year, there's been some problems with animals going missing." "Have others suffered losses too?" Maud asked. "I hadn't heard about any, but at the Lucky L." "Those are the only ones I've heard of," Edith said. "Marshall said they can't tell if it's wild dogs or wolves," Doris said, looking queasy. "Or rustlers. He said everyone will have to be on special alert when they're traveling." Judith frowned. She remembered her brother's comment, but she hadn't been listening closely. Just when she'd begun to feel less like she was living in the wilderness, something like this had to happen. She would never have survived as one of those pioneer women. "What man do you suggest serve on our committee?" Judith asked, pulling them back on topic. "Mr. Hamblin." Mary Teague said his name forcefully, as though she expected the others to argue. But no one did. As long as Judith didn't have to work with him, she was fine. He unsettled her, and she always managed to say the wrong things, something that didn't please her at all. What good were her years of training if she had so little self-control? Often over the last week, Judith had wondered what a terrible impression he must have of her after she'd lashed out at him at dinner, and after he'd honored her. And why had he done that? She rubbed her temples. She thought too much. "Are you not well?" Edith asked softly, leaning closer to Judith. "I'm fine. Why?" "You've not been yourself the last few meetings. Are you losing heart with the society? I hope not, because I can always count on you." The sheriff's sister said the words so simply, and yet with such heart, that Judith was warmed by the compliment. "I'm sorry. I've just been distracted of late." "I'm sure even with someone as sweet as Doris, there must be some adjustment when another woman moves into your home. What would I do if Abe were ever to marry?" Edith let out a deep breath. "I'd have nowhere to go." "Wouldn't you continue to live with him?" Judith asked. "I'm not sure. My brother's place isn't all that large. It wouldn't be easy to have my own space as it is for you in the Circle B. What if he married someone who didn't want me around?" "That would be terrible," Judith said. "I'm beginning to understand just how fortunate I've been to have Doris as my sister-in-law." "With Judith and Mr. Hamlin working together to organize the event," Mary said, marking the paper before her, "it's sure to be a success. It's settled." "What was that?" Judith asked, barely biting back a yelp of surprise. "Were you wool-gathering again?" Maud asked with a grin, but didn't wait for an answer. "You were already coordinating the different events. My brother will simply assist you. Since we're all coming to your house for dinner on Sunday, you'll have a chance to talk about it. It's the one day he really takes a break." She and the other ladies rose. Judith remained in her chair, trying to settle her emotions. The smell of popping corn pulled Luke from his office where he'd been going over his inventory. Those dreaded wolves had managed to get another one of his calves and injured its mother. He might lose them both. They sometimes had problems with wolves, but not normally until later in the season when the animals were hungry. Luke found a comfortable seat in the parlor where Frances had insisted on putting up the Christmas tree she and Nick had cut down that afternoon. They and Tom McDaniel, with his youngest son, Junior, were stringing popcorn. "It's a little early for that, isn't it? How are you going to keep that thing watered?" Luke asked. It's 2 weeks before Christmas yet. Tom built a clever basin. Frances held a needle as though it were an odd contraption. Nick twitched beside her, obviously wanting to show her how to do it, but not daring. Well, you'd better keep that basin full. I don't want my house to burn down. Luke sat next to his housekeeper and examined her strand of cranberries. Where did you get these? Doris said Mr. Breckinridge always orders some in from Washington for his Christmas tree, Mrs. McDaniel said. She had him get some for us, too. Luke made a face. We're going to have rotting fruit on our tree? I'm told they dry nicely. You can use a needle. How about you help me? She pushed the bowl of cranberries toward him and indicated some thread. Before he could come up with an excuse not to, the sound of bells approaching the house brought him to his feet. Charles had recently invested in a sleigh, and Luke wondered if it might be him. When Luke opened the door, he found his brother-in-law helping Maud up the steps. I'll put this in the barn and be right in, Charles said. Don't worry, Luke said, offering his sister his arm. I'll make sure she gets inside safely. That man, Maud said with a sigh as she clasped his elbow. He's driving me mad with his protectiveness. I'm not sure what you'd expect from a man who's going to be a father next year. Everyone's decorating the tree in the parlor, Luke said, helping her with her coat. Oh, lovely. Charles has been so busy, we haven't been able to go looking for hours yet. Maud hung up her hat and turned as though to go to the parlor, when she paused and looked at him instead. Mary asked me to tell you what your assignment is for the Christmas fair. What? Luke took a step back. Why do I have an assignment? Because you had so many great suggestions for the men's event. You'll be working closely with Judith, but Mary is quite concerned that the two of you get right on it. We need Mr. Hawkins at the newspaper to get the word out. Mr. Teague has agreed to accept sign-ups for the different events at the dry goods store. Maud didn't wait for Luke to say anything, but hurried toward the parlor. He wanted to follow and tell her he wouldn't do it. Luke had his own plans with Judith Breckinridge, and serving on a planning committee that was likely to put them at odds with each other wasn't one of them. As he took a step toward the parlor, he thought again of Gypsy. He was a man used to identifying problems and fixing them. He understood how to handle a mistreated horse, but not a complicated and caustic woman, especially a beautiful one. Was this a way for him to get closer to her? He shoved his hands in his pockets and headed back to his office instead. You're quiet tonight, Marshall said to Judith at dinner that evening. Are you not well? Doris glanced up from ladling stew for Florence. You have been looking a little peaked since the meeting today. I'm just tired, Judith said. It wasn't quite a lie. She was tired, but it was because she kept having dreams about Luke Hamblin, and now she'd have to work with him until the event was over. And that on top of the two families now sitting together at church, and alternating having Sunday dinners together at each other's homes. Judith will be working with Luke to coordinate the Christmas fair, Doris told Marshall. We're going to have a Christmas fair? Lydia asked, clapping her hands to her chest, her expression turning dreamy. Yes, Judith said, unable to keep the sarcasm from her voice. Because bringing culture to Lilac City must include men doing rope tricks and shooting their guns. You mustn't forget the cowboy poetry, Marshall chuckled. Don't you start too, Judith said with a scowl. I had a talk with Mrs. Teague the other day, Doris said. It seems Hank Knox was misbehaving in her Sunday school class, and she wondered if it might be best if he stayed home. And what words of wisdom did you have for her, my love? Marshall asked. That he needs chances to practice paying attention and demonstrating he has good manners. She shook her head. The boy has a good heart, But except for his grandmother, he doesn't have good examples in his home. The only place he can learn civilized behavior, Doris glanced at Judith, is at school and at church. The rowdy cowhands of Lilac City are not schoolboys, Judith said, if that's what you're trying to imply. No, they're not, Doris gave one of her soft smiles. But just like Hank, they only know what they've been taught. We have an opportunity to show them there's a bigger world out there than what they've seen so far. How did I not realize I was marrying such a wise woman? Marshall leaned over and kissed his wife. Judith's brother had certainly not learned such loving behavior in their childhood home. Even so, she had to blink at the sudden emotion flooding through her. Watching her brother and Doris, and also Charles and Maud, with their unabashed affection, was startling. Polite society did not approve of such demonstrations. It made Judith reflect upon her interactions with Teddy. They'd been completely devoid of anything that might smack of true feelings. She considered different married couples back home, and couldn't think of any who treated their spouses like this, not even her friends who had recently wed. Were any of them in love with each other? Until she'd come here, Judith had never considered love to be important in a marriage. Now she wondered. "What do you have in mind for the schedule?" Doris asked, her cheeks still flushed. Judith refused to fall victim to envy, as tempting as it was. The Lancaster sisters had suffered enough at the hands of their uncle and were entitled to their happiness. It made her wonder if Edgar had managed to find out something. "Judith?" Marshall asked, watching her. "Doris asked you a question." "I'm sorry," Judith shook her head. "I was wondering if you'd heard from Edgar." Doris stilled, and her face paled. She still wasn't completely comfortable talking about Marshall's cousin, who'd been coerced by her uncle to bring her to him. Marshall covered her hand with his. "I received a telegram from him this morning. He says he has news for us and will be back in a few days, assuming the weather holds. I hear the storms have been bad north of us, and it's caused some delays with the trains." "Is Frances safe?" Doris asked. "Even if your brother wasn't watching her like a hawk, that Nick Reynolds always seems to be in her company." Marshall helped himself to another roll. "And how is that appropriate?" Judith couldn't help asking. It was simply another society rule the youngest Lancaster sister seemed determined to cast aside. "There's nothing untoward in their relationship," Doris said without a hint of doubt. "Frances views him the same way she does Luke. In fact, when we first arrived here last spring, my brother gave Nick the responsibility to watch over her. He's taken her under his wing just like a younger sister. He left one behind in Texas. From what he said, he misses her a great deal, and Frances helps to fill that emptiness." Judith barely prevented herself from sniffing in disdain, something Marshall had chastised her about too many times since she'd come from New York. Until he'd brought it up, she hadn't known she was doing it. It had been something she'd picked up from her friends. "It still isn't fitting for a lady," Judith said. "My sister is fond of saying, and firmly believes, I might add, that society's rules are merely the methods men used to control women. She also says we're 5 years into a new century, and it's time for women to be in charge of their own lives." Doris gave a soft laugh. "She can't wait until she's 21 and can vote. That alone will keep her in Wyoming." Judith shook her head. "You don't think women should vote?" Marshall asked with a frown. "William Bright, the man who introduced the bill in Wyoming, said something along the lines of his wife being as good as any man, that she was definitely better than convicts and idiots." Judith gave her brother a flat look, and he laughed. "Don't like the comparison to convicts and idiots, huh? Well, I happen to agree with him. I'll even go further to say women are better than men in many things. I've had to work with plenty of stupid men, believe me, but they're allowed to vote. Why not you ladies?" "I never thought of it," Judith said, considering her words. "It's not ladylike." "Are you saying it's not ladylike to use your brains?" Marshall asked. "I will pit your intelligence against almost any man I've met." Marshall reached over and patted her hand. "Don't shortchange yourself. It might not seem like it, but we Westerners are driving this new century." "Perhaps." "I'm sure it's a wise decision to have you and Luke organizing the Christmas fair," Marshall said. Judith didn't respond. She hadn't needed the reminder she'd be working with Luke, but her brother's comments had given her pause. Was she shortchanging herself and her role in this burgeoning community? Did this still wild country need women who challenged the rigid social structure found in the East? She wasn't sure she was comfortable with the idea of Frances Lancaster as a role model for women of the future. Judith rubbed her temple. She was getting a headache. Chapter 5. As Luke rode to the Circle B ranch for his meeting with Judith, he wasn't sure what to expect. He hadn't missed her expression when he'd first suggested the manly events, as the ladies of the society had taken to calling them. It had been obvious Judith hadn't approved. After he'd been commanded by his brothers-in-law and Abe to represent the men on the committee, Luke had spoken with Doris about what his approach should be. All his sister could say was Judith was likely offended by the events because they didn't fit what she considered a cultural event. If Judith was going to resist the events, he didn't want to waste his time. Culture, sophistication, those were things he couldn't imagine coming to Lilac City for a very long time, if ever. Not at the level Judith was used to and seemed to want. His thoughts drifted back to the Thanksgiving meal when he'd gained insight about her. Was her dissatisfaction because she refused to let go of her former life and the people who'd rejected her? He gave a rueful chuckle. As a rancher, he hadn't had a need for deep thinking about that kind of thing, and certainly not about a woman. A gust of wind drove a chill as cold as a knife down his back, and Luke shifted his collar. Dang, but it was going to be a miserable winter if it continued like this. He'd lost another 2 head of cattle, with wolves already preying on the herds. What would February be like? The light from Marshall Breckinridge's large house gave off a warm and inviting appearance, making the cold seem to cut through Luke's coat even worse. He took the road to the barn and turned his horse over to one of the hands there before trudging through the snow to the house. Doris must have been waiting for him because she opened the door even as he was still stomping his feet. "Come in, come in!" She tugged him inside and shut the door. "Whatever were the two of you thinking to plan a meeting on such a terrible night?" "I didn't have time to do it during the day." Luke gave his sister a hug, and she took his hat and scarf. "Hang up your coat. Judith is in the parlor waiting for you with some hot coffee." Luke rubbed his hands together and strode to the room where the monthly teas had been held during the summer. The warmth of the day he'd brought Doris to help now seemed like an eternity ago. It was a shame they couldn't capture the summer weather for days like today. Judith must have heard him enter the room, but she didn't look up, continuing to examine something on the writing desk on her lap. He still wasn't sure what to expect from the meeting. He wished Marshall had been willing to take it on, but he'd cried off, saying he was a newly married man who had to spend time with his bride. Luke headed to the table with a coffee pot on it and poured himself a cup. It was near the fireplace, so he turned to warm his backside. Judith still hadn't acknowledged him. Was this her way of showing she didn't approve of his being included? "It's no skin off my nose to not be a part of this little committee," he said, being sure to keep his tone mellow. "I've got a ranch to run and plenty of important things to do." Judith looked at him then, one brow arched. "And you don't consider our little committee's unimportant efforts to be worth your time?" Luke studied her for a second. If she'd been a man, he'd have guessed she was angling for a fight. Did women do that too? It wasn't like he'd had a lot of experience with them in the last decade. Mrs. McDaniel didn't count. She'd always bossed him around like one of her boys. She and his mother had been like opposite sides of a coin. One woman delicate and gracious, the other woman the salt of the earth, who wouldn't let manners get in the way of something that needed to be said. In spite of her obsession with proper manners and etiquette, he wondered if there was anything delicate about Judith Breckinridge. He put down his cup and sat on the couch beside her. She looked alarmed and shifted away from him. "I'm not your enemy, Judith. Why do you treat me like one?" Her face colored, and she wouldn't meet his gaze. Luke raised his hand and gently covered hers with it. He liked the feel of her soft skin under his. Without a thought, he ran his thumb over the top of her hand. She gave a little gasp and looked up at him. It took him a second to remember what he'd meant to say. "I understand it means a great deal to you to bring some of the culture you love to Lilac City. It's a good thing, too. We need more civilization, as Sheriff Vosberg is always saying. But if you only offer culture to people who already have it, you're preaching to the choir." "Yes." Her voice had an odd edge to it, and she stared down at their hands. "I'm only here to help. I'll do anything I can to make my sisters happy." Judith's gaze shot up to meet his again. Her whole body had stiffened, and she pulled back her hand like she was worried he had lice or something. What had he done now? There was no understanding the woman. Did he have to keep reminding Judith he only thought of her as a sister? Her hand still tingled where he'd touched it, and she clenched her fist. Inhaling deeply, she forced herself to speak calmly. "I'm pleased to hear you wish to make us happy." Luke blinked as though her words confused him. She chose to ignore his expression. "I understand your analogy about preaching to the choir. Believe it or not, I've given it a great deal of thought since the meeting." Judith shifted uncomfortably. "I'm merely concerned bringing in a series of events which are obviously not cultured will confuse the people who need to be educated." Luke leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He turned his head to look at her. "What gives you the right to decide what's cultured and what's not?" It was Judith's turn to blink, and she had to remind herself she was trying not to be cross with people, especially Luke. She took a deep breath. "My social status and education?" She wished she didn't sound so much like one of her prim finishing school instructors. "You forgot. I also come from your social status. I attended university until my mother's death. I used to share your bias." "Bias?" Her voice came out higher than she'd intended. "Yes, bias. We both were taught things had to be done a certain way, and it was the only right one." Luke straightened and leaned back in his chair. "Marshall told me once about a Chinese woman who worked for your mother when she married." At the memory of the sweet old woman, Judith's shoulders relaxed. "Yes, she did." "Did you try to force her to change her ways and thoughts?" "Of course not." "Why?" At first, Judith wasn't going to respond, but there was something in his eyes that softened the confrontational edge to his question. "Because she'd come from an ancient and dignified land which she loved. She learned how to be a good maid to my mother but never surrendered her culture when she was on her own. And you know this because you saw her when she was on her own, am I right? Luke asked. My father was not a comfortable man. When I was young, I especially found it difficult to gain his favor. Judith dropped her gaze, her hands going cold at the memory. Hide from him in her room while she worked on mending. She would tell me about her childhood in China. I understand. At his soft words, Judith glanced up and found him staring at the fireplace. My father loved my mother, but he had a bit of a wild streak, Luke said, still not looking at Judith. His father had forced him to go into the family business, but he hated it. Even though he had a wife and a son he was responsible for, my father took risks. The last one he accepted was a challenge to race a particularly dangerous route. His horse stepped in a rabbit hole, and they both went down. He broke his neck. She was struck by a sense of camaraderie with him and said, My father is a different kind of risk-taker. He broke my mother's heart and destroyed our family's reputation. I know you're paying the price, Luke said, his voice soft and commiserating. Just as you did at the hands of your stepfather. When he winced, she regretted mentioning the man. Doris and Maud always spoke so lovingly of their father, but Judith had always thought he sounded like two different men. One the kind and loving father of the sisters, and the other the cold and heartless one who had disowned Luke. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have mentioned him. I assume your brother told you about my situation. The bitterness in Luke's voice carried the same taste as the one she had for her father. You, at least, can claim no blood connection. Judith smiled, trying to lighten the mood. There is that. Luke gave a dark chuckle. I apologize for taking out my frustrations on you upon your arrival. She sighed. It wasn't ladylike and proves me the worst hypocrite. Luke leaned forward and gave her a measured gaze. Everyone's a hypocrite. We can't help it. How so? Judith straightened, prepared to argue. Because all of us have personal ethics we fail to live up to from time to time. One of mine is to be a patient man. When I lose my temper, which happens too often, I'm a hypocrite. Luke rubbed the back of his neck. It's one of many things in my life I'm forever working to improve. Some days I'm better than others, but I'd rather be a struggling hypocrite than a man with no morals. Judith stared at him. Luke's words spoke to her like nothing had since the disclosure of her father's criminal behavior. I didn't mean to render you speechless. That's quite an accomplishment, if I do say so myself. He winked at her, lifting the mood, and she smiled. You, sir, are a tease. She picked up her lap desk again. Now, I've made a list of the events the Society decided to include and tried to spread out a mixture of the manly events with the cultured ones. Because a manly event can't also be a cultured one, he said dryly. That was not what I said. He arched a brow, and Judith gave a soft laugh. But that was what I meant. I apologize. Now, tell me if you like the order. She handed him the sheet of paper. They spent the next half hour going over the list, with Luke making several recommendations for moving events around. My biggest concern is I don't like the idea of a rowdy activity just prior to the Christmas story, which Doris's scholars will perform.
I'm going to be an angel, Uncle Luke,
Lydia cried, skipping into the parlor in her dressing gown. The exuberant 5-year-old threw herself into his arms for a hug. I'm Mary, Florence said with an air of superiority expected from a big sister, even one who was only a year older. She was more circumspect in the way she hugged him, but squealed just as loudly as Lydia had when he tickled her. Judith glanced at Marshall and Doris, who'd followed the girls into the parlor. A twinge of jealousy at the happiness of the new family stung Judith, but she pushed it away. Luke might have to battle to keep control of his temper, but she had to fight the envy that continued to plague her. She liked his comment about being a struggling hypocrite. The obvious happiness of both Maud and Doris took nothing from Judith, and she truly did not resent them. Judith simply wished she would have a family of her own someday. She could only hope that, when enough time had passed, some man, a decent man, could look beyond the black mark on her family name. It would take someone very high in society indeed who could weather undamaged the stain she'd bring.
Mama Doris is going to show us how to make pine Christmas wreaths tomorrow to go with the tree,
Lydia said, jumping from Luke's lap.
It makes the house smell so good.
That reminds me, Luke said. Have you already put up your tree? We've always put ours up on Christmas Eve, but Frances insisted on doing it a few days ago. I'm afraid it'll burn the house down.
We put up our tree yesterday. We won't use candles until Christmas Eve,
Doris said. Judith is quite clever in the way she strings cranberries. Really? Luke glanced at her expectantly. I'd like to see that.
Yes,
both Florence and Lydia cried, taking his hands and pulling him from the room. It's nothing special, Judith said, her chest tightening. What if he didn't like them? Come along, her brother said, taking her arm before she could flee. You won't be casting your pearls before swine, so have no fear. Judith allowed him to pull her into the library, where they decided to put the tree. She really had been pleased with the effect and the touch of elegance her garlands had given the tree. It seemed she might have a creative streak after all. We were just going to string together a few strands of popcorn and some with cranberries, Doris said, studying the tree. And then Judith suggested mixing and matching. The effect is quite lovely. Orange slices? Luke asked, his eyes scanning the strands. I'd ordered a case of oranges, Marshall said, coming to stand next to Doris and putting his arm around her shoulders. They froze, and I was afraid we'd have to throw them out. But Mrs. Hauser dried the slices to use them in tea. Judith had the idea to add them as decorations. Do you have any of the slices left over? Luke asked, looking at Judith. Quite a few. Why? She asked. Because there are a few families I'd like to give Christmas trees to. Judith glanced at her sister-in-law, and it was as though they shared a mind, both of their faces lighting up at the same time. I was speaking with Reverend Pierce yesterday, Doris said, and he mentioned a list of families who are struggling. They can afford the basics, but nothing extra. She looked at her new stepdaughters. You mustn't speak of this to anyone outside the family. Wouldn't it be a lovely surprise? Oh, yes, Florence clutched her hand. We know which of the scholars don't eat well at lunch. Well, it sounds like we have an extra holiday assignment, Luke said softly to Judith. I hope I haven't added to your burdens. She glanced up into his soft eyes. The way he was watching her made her want very much not to disappoint him. I can do it if I have help. Are you offering? Luke chuckled. I guess I should, since it's my idea. Looks like we'd best get to work on another list. Chapter 6. It's obviously not a pack of wolves, Abe. And now we're sure it's not wild dogs either. Look at him. Luke prodded the large dog's body. He's too fleshed to be attacking out of hunger. What kind of breed is that? I'm sure it's got some Bullenbeißer in it, the sheriff said, nudging the animal. I've never heard of it. Luke's feet were going numb from the cold, so he began to dance around to keep the blood flowing. It's kind of a bulldog they breed in Germany. Get the significance of the name? Abe shook his head. I don't like this. Well, I sure don't like it. I've lost 6 head of cattle since the beginning of the month, Luke said. It's almost as though my herd's been targeted. Charles turned to stare at him, his expression troubled. That animal's a crossbreed. From the way Tom McBride described the attack, it's well trained. You haven't had any words with anyone, have you? You mean someone who might want to get even with me by running me out of business? No. The only man I'm in competition with is my brother-in-law, and we get along fine. Luke turned to his foreman and said, I'd like to take this carcass back. It's cold enough it won't rot. Tom seemed glad to have something to do and signaled a couple of the cowhands to help lift the beast. Luke wrapped the scarf around his mouth again and mounted his horse. While no one else in the area had reported attacks like the ones he'd been experiencing, it seemed clear he was being targeted, but he couldn't imagine why. The men were silent as they headed back toward the ranch. When Charles would normally have branched off to head into town with the sheriff, he signaled for Luke to stop. What is it? He asked, pulling up. Do you mind, Charles asked, if we get Jim Harkins out here to take a photograph of that dog? You want to put it in the paper? Luke asked, surprised. That wasn't what I had in mind, but it's not a bad idea. Charles tilted his head, considering. The notice would have everyone in the area looking around for animals like this, in case there's more than one. But what I was thinking was to send a copy to an acquaintance of mine. He's also a Pinkerton agent, but his father breeds dogs. I'd like to get his thoughts on it. That beast Tom brought down is out of place around here. I'm not going to argue with you, Luke said. It's important to protect my herd, but there's also the danger that it could have attacked people. I hope we got the only one. As a precaution, Charles said, I'll make sure Jim knows it's a rush. Hopefully he can get out here before Christmas. The sooner the better. Luke urged his horse forward and said over his shoulder, If we don't get this settled, I won't have a herd left by spring. It was an exaggeration, of course, but winter was always tough on a herd. This year looked especially so. The additional losses from these attack dogs would only make it worse. By the time Luke rode into the barn, he was beginning to wonder if he'd ever get warm again. He took care of his horse and made sure he had food before heading to the house. It wasn't until he was leaving the barn that he recognized a Circle B sleigh. It was the one Judith usually used. Drat it, he'd forgotten she was supposed to come today. Luke broke into a run. Now he'd kept her waiting. As soon as he entered the house, Frances reached for his coat. You'd best hurry. She was just talking about leaving. Did you ask her to stay for supper? He asked, pulling off his scarf and handing it to her. Of course I did, but it's getting late. She said she wanted to be home before dark. Frances gave a meaningful glance at the window. It's too late for that now. Luke straightened his shirt and strode to the parlor where he found Judith looking at the Christmas tree. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression cold. I'm sorry I kept you waiting, he said. Tom brought down a dog that killed one of my cows. That's 6 of them now. We had the sheriff out to look at it. Judith had turned to face him, her expression full of concern. Marshall mentioned the trouble with wolves or a wild dog pack. He's been worried they might attack his herd, too. Attack is the key word. It was an attack dog. Luke indicated she should sit. With a stunned expression, she sank to the sofa next to her bag where she usually kept her society paperwork. Are you at liberty to tell me more? She asked, her voice subdued. Luke explained how he'd been forced to put more men on watch because of the attacks on his herd. When he described the dog, she frowned. Do you know something about animals like these? Not from personal experience, but my father was friends with men who were into dog fights. On more than one occasion, my mother and I were forced to leave the table when the men would begin describing the events. On one occasion, I wanted to prove I wasn't merely a weak female and stayed longer than I should have. Judith shuddered, her face having gone pale. You don't have to say more. Luke reached over and covered her hand with his. No, I'm fine. It's a thoroughly despicable pastime. She turned her hand under his and clasped it, as though for strength. One of the men talked about the German Bullenbeiser breed you mentioned. He said he was breeding them with pit bulls, which he said were noted for not letting go of their prey. As I was leaving, he said something about using these new animals as attack dogs. Luke leaned back on the sofa, but didn't release her hand. He liked the idea he was offering support to this rigidly independent woman. You wouldn't happen to remember the man's name, would you? Philip Rousseau. Have you ever heard of him? She asked. No. Luke groaned in frustration. I just don't understand why someone would come after me. It can't be cheap to hire someone with these animals. If there'd been a train wreck or something and the animal had gotten loose, it might explain why it was in this part of the country. But I haven't heard of any train wrecks since I've been here. Judith shifted, but didn't move her hand, which was turning warm in his. Luke wondered if he should release it, but she gave no indications she wanted him to, so he didn't. No train wrecks. Well, hopefully there's only the one animal. Your men killed it. Perhaps the attacks will stop now. From your mouth to God's ears, Luke said with all the fervency he had inside. He'd always worked hard to be a good neighbor, and it troubled him he might have become a target for some kind of vendetta. I'll keep praying for you, Judith said, her voice soft. He blinked. You've been praying for me? She fiddled with the corner of her bag and avoided looking at him. Luke reached over to place a gentle finger under her chin. She didn't resist when he lifted it, until she finally met his gaze. Her rich brown eyes watched him, open and vulnerable. His attention was drawn to her mouth, and he wondered what it would be like to kiss her. Unlike the handful of times the random thought had hit him before, Luke didn't want to push it aside. But that would be taking advantage of her trust. Regretfully, he dropped his hand. It's nice to have another sister to pray for me. Luke leaned back. I've already taken too much of your time today, for which I humbly apologize again. Let's go over that list, and you can tell me who you want me to bully about getting their tasks done. Chapter 7. Judith clenched her teeth. It took every ounce of restraint in her body to keep from slapping him, to put some sense into that stubborn head of his. She took her time removing the papers from her bag to calm her shaking hands. She wasn't often sure what was in Luke's thoughts, but a second ago she had no doubt. Having been engaged before, she knew what it looked like when a man wanted to kiss her. For a second, she'd been sure he was going to, and her body had started to tremble in anticipation. But then, he hadn't. Why did he insist on calling her his sister? She was not his sister. No decent man would look at his sister the way he just had. For a second, she let herself imagine what it would have been like to have taken control of the situation herself, and pulled his face to hers to kiss him. He never would have looked at her that way again, and rightly so. No lady would behave in such a way. Judith wished it were proper for a lady to broach such a topic with a man. Once again, she found herself sympathizing with Francis's sentiments. It was unfair that men could be obvious in showing their interest in a woman, but if a woman did the same thing, She was considered fast. Judith gave a mental sigh. Some cowboy poetry will be the best lead-in to the Christmas program, she said, keeping her voice devoid of emotion. Society prevented her from broaching the subject, so she mustn't allow Luke to see the effect it had on her. I'm not acquainted with any of the men who write it, so I'm hoping you'll help with that. It would be especially nice if they had something to share with a message to fit the feel of the holiday and being with families. Judith had received a letter from her mother earlier. While she sounded as though she was making the most of her new life, there'd been a melancholy tone to the words. It would be the first Christmas Judith had spent without her mother. Unexpectedly, her eyes filled with tears. Are you missing someone? Luke asked, his voice soft and tentative. My mother. Judith pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. Now that you mention it, I'm surprised she didn't come with you to live here with Marshall. Mother fled even farther away from New York than I did. Her mother is from England, and returned there when my grandfather died. We tried to support each other when the accusations against my father began, but when the police came to the house and arrested him, the familiar stab of shame hit her, and Judith's throat tightened. It's all right. You don't have to talk about it. But Judith suddenly had a desperate need to speak of it to someone. When she'd first arrived in Wyoming, the pain had still been too strong, and she hadn't talked of it with Marshall. With the passing of each day, it'd become harder to speak the words and easier to push them deep inside her. She'd thought if she were strong enough, she could force herself to forget what had happened altogether. My mother traveled to England to be with her mother and asked me to accompany her, Judith said with a sniff. But grandmother had remarried a man with a title. Rather than bringing attention to the scandal, my mother must rusticate at his country estate. She is content with solitude, but I need more people around me. I was afraid I'd go mad surrounded only by my mother and servants. I didn't understand that by staying in my childhood home, I'd be abandoned by my fiancé and shunned by the people I thought were my friends. She was crying now. Ah, Judith. Luke set aside the papers and put his arm around her shoulders. She turned into his chest. When her pent-up emotions were spent, Luke patted her shoulder. Have you talked to Marshall about this? No. Judith turned away from him and delicately blew her nose. Why? She shifted to face him. He doesn't understand what it was like, and he's always been thick-skinned. It's why he was able to leave home and never look back. I've known your brother a long time, and I can guarantee you he's looked back. Many times. Same as I have. Luke ran his hand over her back once more and moved it to his lap. Look, we didn't start off on the right foot. That was my fault, and I must apologize. Judith wiped at her eyes again. I was so ill-mannered when we first met. When I met everyone, I was so used to the disdain and condescension back home, I assumed everyone here would treat me the same. It was foolish of me. Once again, I understand. Luke covered her hand with his. I was angry when I first got here. You can ask Tom. I'd loved my mother dearly, and it's only recently I was able to forgive her for marrying again. To be honest, I resented Lancaster from the beginning. I was already holding a grudge against the man, even before he started treating me so poorly. How old were you when your mother remarried? 9. You were a child, Luke. Judith took his hand in both of hers. He was the adult and should have worked to earn your respect, if not your love. I don't understand how a man who could love his wife so much could treat her son the way he did you. Ever since the girls came to live with me, I've been wondering about it myself. Honestly, I think he couldn't stand that my mother had ever loved another man. And you were proof that she had. Judith wished she knew how to give comfort for the pain in his voice. Yes. After my mother's death and funeral, her husband made a great show of having his attorney come to the house and write me out of his will. I hadn't expected an inheritance from him anyway, though I'd hoped he'd continue to pay for college. The hardest thing was when he forbade me to see my sisters. I was furious. Marshall says you came out here to make your fortune. I'd inherited some money from my father. I wouldn't get it until I was 21, but I could borrow against it. I had a chum whose uncle had come out to Wyoming to give it a try. He knew Tom McDaniel and suggested I get in touch with him. Tom took this 19-year-old greenhorn under his wing and taught me how to be a rancher. Luke chuckled. I'd assumed, because I was a good rider and had tended my horse, I knew enough. Tom's been more than my foreman. He's one of my best friends, and he's been like a father to me. It's Martha who's helped me to let go of my anger at my stepfather. I can't say I've exactly forgiven him yet. I find myself resentful too often still. But it's not controlling my life anymore. It's something you're going to need to understand before you can find peace. You have to move on. I'm not sure I know how. The pain is still so raw. Judith had to blink her eyes rapidly to keep from crying again. Martha had told me I had to face my future and leave the past behind me. If I was forever remembering what I'd lost, it'd tie me down like Marley's chains. Dickens, Marley? Judith asked, surprised. Yep, and Martha was right. As soon as I started putting my strength into building a life here and not counting my grievances against Lancaster, his wrongs lost their power over me. Then Reverend Pierce gave an excellent sermon on forgiveness. He reminded me it was to help us, and not necessarily the person who's wronged us. Luke chuckled again. I'm not a particularly spiritual man, but I remember sitting in that pew and going over in my mind all the whooping the Lord did in the Old Testament. He'd said vengeance was his, and I could trust him to do a fine job where it was needed. It was like a huge burden had been lifted from my shoulders. I'd come into church that Sunday carrying the weight of my anger and resentment, but I left it behind. Well, I thought I'd overcome it. What? Judith broke off as understanding struck her. Oh, you mean William Lancaster. His attempts to get hold of your sisters are bringing up your desire for vengeance again. Exactly so. He's got me fired up in ways I haven't been in years. Will you help me overcome my anger? I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask, considering I'm struggling again myself. Luke's dark brown eyes met hers. Something powerful lurked in them that sent a wonderful warmth flooding through her. Perhaps we can help each other, Judith said, her voice soft with hope. You've already overcome this once, so you have experience I don't. If you're willing to help me when I forget to look to my future, I could help you do the same. You might be just what I need. Luke rose and, still holding her hand, brought her to her feet. He leaned closer as though he meant to kiss her cheek. She shut her eyes to resist the temptation to wish for more. When his lips brushed hers, Judith's lids popped open. She quickly closed them again, giving herself to the warmth of his skin. He moved as though to pull back, but she slid her hand around his neck. Oh, Judith, Luke said against her lips, pulling her close against him, where his mouth had been soft before. It firmed, becoming more demanding. Her heart pulsed in her head, making her dizzy. She could hardly breathe. Then Luke pushed back, breaking free of her hand, gasping for breath. I am so sorry. I didn't mean to. Stop. Judith put her trembling fingers to his mouth. Don't you dare apologize. I am not your sister, and I do not wish you to see me as one. Luke clasped her hand and pressed it against his chest. The way his heart was racing as fast as hers sent another thrill through her. Are you sure? He asked. I've never been surer of anything in my life. Judith had longed after him for months, but she'd never imagined he might feel the same way. And I've been wanting to do that longer than I should admit. Luke took her hand again and brought it to his lips. If you would entertain my suit, I'll speak with your brother. There was something too formal in the way Luke had said the words. He couldn't feel some kind of obligation, could he? You would court me because you care for me, Judith said, choosing her words carefully, her fear making her wary. And not because you feel you must after having kissed me like that? Because I care for you, yes. His gaze held hers with an intensity that made her entire body tingle. Even though I'm a felon's daughter? Judith held her breath. A lot of people come out west looking for a clean start. You're no different. And you didn't break the law. Luke tried to pull her close again. When she resisted, he said, I promise I'm already falling in love with you, Judith Breckinridge. Her heart soared, and she threw her arms around his neck. He'd barely touched his mouth to hers when the parlor door opened. They broke apart, but he refused to release her hand. Jim said he'll come in the morning to take the photograph of that dog, Tom said, striding into the room. Seeing Luke wasn't alone, Tom paused. He looked at their clasped hands and grinned, saying, It's getting mighty cold outside. If you're going to see Miss Breckinridge home, you'll want to head out soon. I'll tell Junior he's got chaperone duty. He winked, but there was caution in his gaze before he headed for the door. You'd best be talking to Marshall tonight. Chapter 8. Luke found the drive to the Circle B, besides bitingly cold, to be an awkward one. The cowhand who'd driven Judith out to the Lucky L had pulled far ahead. If Junior hadn't been driving the sleigh, Luke and Judith would have been alone. She shivered beside him. Are you warm enough? Luke put his arm around her. I am now. She lifted her scarf-shrouded face to him. New York winters can be bitter, and Marshall warned me Wyoming could be worse. I didn't realize your winters came so early. It's still technically the fall. If it continues on this way, it'll be the worst one we've had yet. For a second, Luke wished he could steal a kiss, but pushed the thought aside. He recalled how recently he'd interrogated first Charles and then Marshall about courting his sisters. Well, Marshall had bypassed the courting bit and shown up at the Lucky L engaged, the sly dog. What is on your mind? Judith asked. You growled. Luke chuckled. I've never been in a position to ask a man to court his sister before. I'm suddenly sympathizing with Charles's position last summer. Are you wishing you'd been kinder to him? She snuggled a little closer. I wasn't unkind, but at the time I was worried about Maud's happiness. After all these years being out here alone with just me and my ranch to worry about, suddenly having 3 sisters of marriageable age seemed a huge burden. But you're not sorry? Never. From the day Maud was born, I wanted to be her protector. Her father didn't take it well, as you can imagine. It was almost like he thought we were in competition for her love. I wonder now if that added to his resentment of me. Had he shown signs of jealousy about your mother's affection for you? Yes, I was almost 10 when Maud was born. Mother worried her new husband would send me off to boarding school, and she wasn't ready to let me go. If he hadn't loved her as much as he did, I'm sure he'd have sent me away. That was one thing I was sure of, his love for her. Luke rubbed his chin. Frances looks so much like her. From what Doris has told me, he loved the three of them a great deal, too. She and Maud have both remarked on how strange it is their father didn't make better provisions for them upon his death. It was sudden, but it sounds as though he was a man who made plans for far into the future. As their only remaining parent, why would he not have anticipated the possibility he could die? There's a lot of truth in what you say. I admit, I've let my own resentment of the man keep me from considering that too closely. Perhaps it's been a mistake. They sat in silence for a while. It looked like Luke should have been paying more attention to many things, like the beautiful woman in his arms. How could love sneak up on a man like this? If someone had told him 6 months ago he'd come to have such strong emotions for her, he'd have called them a liar. Luke's mind drifted back to the first time he'd seen Judith. Marshall had just collected her from the train station, and she'd barely glanced around her. Dressed in her fancy gown with her coppery curls perfectly coiffed, she'd been a sight to cause every man on the street to pause and take a look. Then she'd taken her brother's arm and walked stiffly with him to his surrey. At the time, Luke had thought her attitude showed her disdain of the little town and the people in it. She'd come across to him as one of those high and mighty ladies from back home, sure they were too good for people in the lowly working class. But there was so much more to the woman. Doris had been the first one to see past the public mask Judith wore. Now that he'd gotten to understand her better, he saw her rigid posture on that first day for what it had been: protection. She'd expected the people of Lilac City to look down on her. "You're very different from how you first appeared," Luke said. "What do you mean?" He described his first impression, and she winced. "How could you have any regard for me if that's what you thought?" Judith tried to pull away. "Because I've learned you're not like that," he said, keeping her close. "But in many ways I was like that," Judith admitted. "Then you've changed." "Some, but it's still a struggle. The people back home had already pulled me from my high horse, as Frances is fond of saying." A gust of wind blew the corner of her scarf. She grabbed it and settled it around her face again. "But I'm afraid I still find myself looking down on many of the people here." "Well, changing our beliefs can be hard." "Until a few months ago, I didn't believe I needed to." "See what I mean? You've been here, 10 months? I don't think the woman I saw get off that train would have purchased an expensive watercolor set for a lowly ranch foreman." Luke's voice was soft as he asked, "What was your first impression of me?" Judith glanced away. "Ho, ho," he said with a chuckle. "It must have been as unflattering as mine was of you." "I saw you as just another dirty cowboy," she said, keeping her face forward. "Ouch." "I must confess I was quite surprised when I saw you at church the following Sunday." "So I didn't clean up too bad?" "Not bad at all." She still didn't look at him, but the warmth in her tone made him wish he could kiss her again. The Circle B ranch house came into view, and Luke's stomach knotted. He moved his arm from her shoulders, but took her hand. "I'm 25, Luke," Judith said, seeming to sense his unease. "He can't refuse to let you court me." "Since Marshall married Doris, our relationship is the best it's been in all the years I've known him. I'm just worried if he doesn't approve of me, it'll make things awkward." "He wouldn't dare." There was something in her tone that reminded him a great deal of Frances. "I hope you're right." Junior pulled the sleigh up to the house. "It's late, so I won't be long," Luke said, rising. "Keep warm in the barn." "Yes, sir." Junior glanced at Judith and shot Luke a cheeky grin. He glared a warning at the young man, who chuckled. Luke shook his head, and he came around the sleigh to lift Judith. He took his time lowering her so he could keep her in his arms longer. She gave a little gasp. Even under the scarf, he could tell her cheeks were flushing. "My brother's office curtains are open, if you want him to see," she said, her words delightfully breathy. "I'd like to tell you I don't care, but I'd be lying." Luke set her on the ground and took a step back, offering her his arm before they headed up the steps. "It's quite sobering and reminds me that if he wouldn't approve of my behavior, I probably wouldn't have approved of him doing it with Doris." "I am not your sister." Judith's voice had taken on that testy edge from her early days. "And don't I know it?" Luke gave her an overtly appreciative glance as they paused at the front door. "And yet you insisted on calling me your sister." He turned to look at her, his face only inches away from hers. "Did that bother you?" He leaned closer. "Very much." Luke would have kissed her, but he heard voices on the other side of the door and turned to reach for the knob. Someone swung open the door to reveal Marshall, who was glaring at them. "Judith's driver came back without her," he said. "I was late for our meeting, so I've escorted her home." "You should be more respectful of my sister's time." "He had a perfectly legitimate reason for being delayed, and I will not stand here and let you castigate him for it," Judith said, now wearing her own glare. "Marshall, you should respect that it's cold out here," Luke said, wondering what had made the man so cross. Marshall's eyes narrowed. "This is ridiculous." Judith pushed past him, pulling Luke with her. "You'll be interested in hearing what happened," she said to her brother as she removed her scarf. Marshall's expression turned from irritation to concern. "Come into my office then, Luke, and tell me about it. Judith, Doris is in the parlor with the girls." He started to turn away. "I'm pretty sure Judith will want to come with us." Luke glanced at her, hoping he was right, and relieved when she gave a soft nod. Marshall tilted his head as he studied how closely Luke and Judith were standing. She stiffened, but her brother only smiled, his expression turning pleased. "Yes, it appears she should." They followed him into the room. A portrait of Marshall's late wife used to grace the mantel above the fireplace by itself. There was now a series of smaller paintings surrounding it, all done by Doris. Every time Luke saw them, he was struck again by how talented she was. Marshall strode to his desk, sat, and signaled they should too. "Is there something of a personal nature you should talk about first?" he asked. Luke glanced at Judith, and she nodded. "I had planned to ask you for permission to court your sister," Luke said, "but she's informed me she's of age and doesn't need your permission." Marshall gave his sister a frustrated scowl before turning his attention on Luke. "And what do you think?" "I wish to make both of you happy. I may not need your permission, but I'd very much like your blessing." Marshall looked at his sister. "You've never mentioned it to me, but a blind man could have seen your growing affection for Luke. Are you sure this is what you want?" "Very sure." "Then you have both my blessing and my permission." Marshall's face turned serious, and he pinned Luke with a hard gaze. "But you will treat my sister with the respect owed her. I saw how you lifted her out of that sleigh just now." "I told you he was spying on us," she muttered. "And you were right," Luke replied before saying to Marshall, I promise to protect Judith's reputation and treat her with proper respect. Thank you. Marshall leaned forward on his desk. Now, tell me what's happened. Tom killed an attack dog who brought down one of my cows. Before Luke could say more, Judith rose. She bent to kiss his cheek. I'll leave you to it. He watched as she left the room. Dang, but she was beautiful. I wasn't sure you were ever going to return her regard, Marshall said when she'd left. I won't deny she's had my attention for a long time, but I've been a bit preoccupied. Luke shook his head, bemused. It sort of snuck up on me. I understand that sentiment perfectly, Marshall said, his voice turning soft for a second. Now, tell me about this attack dog. Judith could barely contain her excitement as she stepped into the parlor. Doris sat on the sofa with Florence and Lydia on each side. They glanced up from the picture book they were reading. I'm glad to see you made it safely home, Doris said. Marshall was worried when your driver returned without you. Then he should have spoken to the man, because he knew Luke was bringing me back. Judith tried unsuccessfully not to smile. He just asked Marshall to court me. Oh, Judith, that's wonderful, Doris cried as she leaped to her feet, the book falling to the floor.
But isn't Uncle Luke your brother now? Florence asked, her little brows furrowed in confusion. Isn't it wrong to marry your brother? Lydia added. Judith laughed, finally free of her frustration at being called Luke's sister. Luke is only my brother-in-law. We share no blood connections. Doris pulled Judith into a hug. I'm so happy for you. Now you'll be my sister-in-law twice over. Judith's stomach tightened. It seemed so presumptuous to speak of marriage. Please don't mention that yet, she said. It's too soon, and I don't wish to scare him away. Are you in love with him? Doris asked. I am. Then have no fear. My brother doesn't frighten easily. Doris gave her another quick hug and then turned to the girls. You two need to get ready for bed. Judith found herself alone. What if he did propose marriage? She would leave the Circle B and become mistress of the Lucky L. How much would she have to learn? Luke served a different clientele from her brothers. Would Luke resent her attempts to bring culture and refinement to the Dude Ranch experience? Worse yet, would the people who came there to experience ranch life not like it? Now she was getting ahead of herself. Judith decided to review the items for the Christmas fair she and Luke had discussed earlier. She collected her bag and pulled out the paperwork. As always, putting things in order calmed her nerves. I told you she'd be in here working, Marshall said, opening the parlor. Where's Doris and the girls? They're preparing for bed, Judith said, putting aside her papers and standing. Oh, I can't miss that. Marshall clapped a hand on Luke's shoulder. I'm giving you the same warning you gave me. His tone was serious, but he softened the words with a grin before leaving. After her thoughts, Judith found herself uncomfortable. Would they suit? Luke seemed to sense her discomfort and extended a hand toward her, his brows raised expectantly. Was that worry in his gaze? She took his hand and he pulled her into his arms. Oh my, she said with a gasp. Warmth flooded her, along with a sense of being cared for and protected. This man would never be like her father, and demean or ridicule her before his friends. Luke wasn't like that, she was sure. Had it always been part of his mettle, or had being forced out of his home to make his own way in the world made him sensitive to others? What? He asked, pressing his lips against her temple. I used to think it would be terrible to be held by a cowboy. Judith met his gaze. All her doubts fled. I like it when you look at me like that. The heat in his eyes made her heart flutter in a delightfully uncomfortable way.
Judith lifted her chin, but Luke shook his head, his expression regretful. I promised your brother I would be a stellar suitor. Will you never kiss me again, then? She brushed her lips against his chin. You are a mischievous woman, Judith Breckinridge. Luke kissed the tip of her nose, released her, and stepped back. But tempting as you are, I gave my word. Judith's heart swelled. Her affection for wealthy and sophisticated Teddy had never come close to the regard she had for this rancher. I'm glad to hear you're a man of your word about women, Marshall said. Judith spun around to find him and Doris standing in the doorway. I'm especially a man of my word about this woman, Luke said. Marshall shot Judith a long, suffering glance. He would chastise her once her beau had departed. Her beau. She couldn't keep from smiling. She hadn't expected to have a beau again, much less Luke Hamblin. Happiness made her willing to accept the rebuke she knew her brother had planned. I'd like to take you on my afternoon rounds tomorrow, Luke said to Judith. There are some people I'd like you to meet. Who will you bring along to chaperone? Marshall asked, keeping his tone light. Junior, of course. He's in the barn waiting for me now. Luke offered his arm to Judith, and she gladly took it. What direction will we be going? She asked. I need to drop off some things in town. We can do that on the way back. That would be lovely. Marshall and Doris walked with them to the door, making it awkward for Judith to bid Luke good night. Is he going to give you a hard time when you go back inside? Luke asked on the step. I can hold my own against my brother. Luke lifted her hand and kissed it. Tomorrow, then. Dress warm. She watched as he skipped down the steps and had to bite back a laugh when he slipped on the bottom step. Once he'd caught his balance, holding his hat to his head, he turned around and grinned at her before he strode toward the barn. Come inside before you freeze to death, Marshall said. Judith smiled, letting her brother take her arm and lead her into the house. Chapter 9. Luke was grim-faced as he stepped into Sheriff Bosberg's office. It'd taken most of the morning to get the monster dog photo taken and then developed.
Have yourself a cup of coffee there,
Abe said, indicating a pot on the stove.
Charles ought to be back from his rounds soon, and I'd like him here for this.
I appreciate it. This is surely brass monkey weather we're having this year. Luke put the folder with the photographs for the sheriff down before going for some coffee. He took a seat and watched as Abe studied the pictures.
That's one mean-looking dog,
the sheriff finally said, setting the photograph down.
It looked worse in person. One of those beasts was bad enough. We're lucky it didn't go after any people.
His voice softened.
Or the school kids.
His mouth dry, Luke met the older man's concerned gaze. With the weather so cold, only the children who had rides had been coming to town for school.
I've lived here in Lilac City for a dang long time, Luke, and I've never seen anything like this. Even as bad as things have been with the sheep wars, there's something especially ugly about this dog.
Abe rubbed his face.
Ever since I investigated the first attack, it's been troubling me. I was sure it had to be a lone wolf.
I'd wondered the same thing, Luke said, staring out the window.
Dogs prefer to run in packs.
Luke shifted to look at the sheriff. If we'd been dealing with a rogue dog,
we'd likely have had more attacks in the surrounding area. That's what Charles and I had decided anyway. It's easier for a wild dog to go after sheep on a smaller farm.
Any sheep farms reporting missing or killed animals? Abe gave a disgusted snort.
They're always reporting missing animals, but it's usually cattlemen who are responsible. There haven't been any tracks to match that beast's.
Luke rose and strode to the window.
It's a real uncomfortable position to have someone come after me. The only thing that's different from last year is your 3 sisters. What would be served for William Lancaster to come after my cat? A possibility struck Luke, and he broke off, his stomach tightening into a knot. As far as they knew, the girls' uncle hadn't heard about Doris's marriage to Marshall Breckinridge. Lancaster would be assuming she and Frances were still living at the Lucky L, with Luke as their only protector. "What's on your mind?" Abe asked, coming to stand by the window. Luke told him. "No other protector, huh?" Sheriff scratched his grizzly beard. "A man would have to be pretty desperate to try to ruin you, so your sisters would have to turn to him for support." Abe grunted. "Well, look who Charles is bringing back with him." I've been wondering when Edgar would finally show up. Luke was still angry with the man. After William Lancaster had discovered his oldest niece, Maud, had already married, he'd coerced Marshall's cousin to come out to the Circle B with the intent to woo away either Doris or Frances. They still hadn't figured out what was driving Lancaster to go to such extremes. "Charles looks like a man with a message." Abe opened the door, then shut it behind them as soon as they'd entered. "Are Wyoming winters always this bad?" Edgar Lowell asked, going immediately to the pot-bellied stove and holding his hands near it. "Not usually this early," Luke said. "What news have you?" Edgar turned to face him, his expression bleak. "I did try to get more details, but William Lancaster is suspicious of everyone. He wasn't pleased at all that I hadn't managed to secure Miss Doris's affections yet and lure her back to Indianapolis." His expression blanched. "He made it quite clear what would happen to me if he had to call in his Italian friends." "Tell them what you did find out," Charles said. "Just that he has something in the works he's sure will secure his possession of Doris and Frances by midwinter." Luke exchanged glances with Abe. "What?" Charles asked, looking between the two men. The sheriff slid over the photograph of the dog. Edgar made a choking sound and sank to a chair as he stared at the picture of the dead animal. "I take it you've seen that beast before?" the sheriff said dryly. "Those Italian men I told you about?" Edgar swallowed. "They threatened me with an animal like that. Said they were trained trackers as well as attack dogs." "So William Lancaster is behind this," Luke growled, grateful the man wasn't in the same room. "They?" Charles asked. "The Italians have access to more than one dog?" "I saw 4 of them and got the impression there were more," Edgar said. "Did they have a handler?" Luke asked. "Yes, a big ugly brute of a man who spoke another language. My guess is German. He was as intimidating as the dogs." Edgar shuddered. "I swear I will never gamble again." "This looks like you are being targeted, Luke," Charles said, his voice low. "And there could be more of these monsters in the area." "Sounds like it." An intense need hit Luke to protect his family and his ranch. A lot of people depended upon the jobs he provided. "Edgar, can you describe the handler well enough for Doris to sketch his likeness?" "Why?" the man asked warily. "Good idea," Abe said. "We can ask around to see if anyone recognizes him." "I'm worried if that handler's around here, he'll have heard about Doris marrying Marshall," Luke said. "If he sends word back to Lancaster, he'll realize Edgar's been keeping things from him. Did their uncle act like he believed you?" The poor man's eyes had widened, but then he frowned and slowly shook his head. "Mr. Lancaster didn't act suspicious of me, just angry at my lack of success. One of the Italians had to do some translating for the dog's keeper." "We have to find him," Charles said, his jaw muscles tight. "He and those dogs are a danger not only to my wife and her family, but to anyone who might cross their path."
Have you heard anything about getting Maud's inheritance? Luke asked. Lancaster's attorney is making excuses about needing more time to liquidate assets and other nonsense. Charles snorted in disgust. I don't care about the money, but there are things in the house that belonged to their mother. You need to put more pressure on your father to discover what he can about what William Lancaster has his hands in, Abe said. I'll bet you anything there's something those girls stand to inherit the man wants. I'll ask Maud what she remembers about her father's business dealings, Charles said. I've got an appointment I need to get to, Luke said. Edgar, I can take you out to the Circle B. That's where I'm headed. Be sure to see if Doris can sketch the German's likeness. Edgar nodded. Chapter 10. Judith kept telling herself Luke could be delayed in coming for her. He'd said he had to take care of business in town beforehand, something to do with the attack dog. She should not be so nervous, but her sleep had been troubled, full of dreams where Luke would come to her as Teddy had, to say they would not suit. She'd distracted herself by spending the morning working with Mrs. Hauser and Doris. The poor young woman had not been prepared to run a house, and there was much for her to learn. Judith only had a few months' experience herself. They'd inventoried the bedding. A successful summer of Dude Ranch guests had taken its toll, with Marshall already receiving reservation requests for the coming spring and summer. They needed to be prepared. The ladies sat around the fire doing simple mending on some sheets that didn't need replacing. It was the most pleasant morning Judith could recall spending with other women. She wasn't a very good seamstress, doing better with fine needlework, something her mother had insisted upon. Judith's stomach growled in a most unladylike manner, and she was glad Luke hadn't arrived yet. I suppose I should see how the soup is coming, Mrs. Hauser said, setting aside the sheet she'd been stitching. She rose, but paused at the sound of bells, looking out the front window. The housekeeper smiled at Judith and said, Ah, it looks like Mr. Luke has arrived, and he's brought Mr. Edgar. Judith's dreams from the night before came back. Would Luke have decided his offer to court her had been a mistake? Oblivious to her distress, Doris began to put away the work, so Judith helped to tidy the room. Edgar strode in, Luke not far behind, bringing a bitter chill with them. I have returned, ladies. Judith. He gave a sweeping bow. Doris. When he straightened, all the bravado was gone, and he said, I've been given an assignment I'll need your help with, but it will wait. Your brother has news for you that I will leave to him. He gave Judith a quick kiss on the cheek and left the room. That sounds quite ominous, Doris said, stepping up to Luke, who'd entered the room. She gave his cheek a quick peck. I'll help Mrs. Hauser set up for lunch. Judith's heart was thumping so hard it was giving her chest a thorough pounding. How could she bear it if Luke rejected her now? When he took her hands, he frowned. You're so cold. He brought first one and then the other to his lips. Judith wanted to cry with relief and to slide into his arms and kiss him. When she rose up on her tiptoes and lightly brushed her lips with his, he froze, closing his eyes. What did it mean? He didn't open his eyes again until she stepped back. But he smiled. As a man of my word and for the record, I didn't initiate that, but I want you to know that I'd very much like to kiss you thoroughly. Judith said a silent prayer of gratitude he hadn't changed his mind. Luke offered her his arm, and she took it. What is this news Edgar brought? Judith asked, working to keep her voice steady as they walked toward the dining room. It appears the attacks on my herd were initiated by William Lancaster. No. Judith paused and made him face her. Yes, but I'd rather not tell the story twice. so let's save it for after lunch.
Come, Daddy,
Florence was saying as she and Lydia towed their father from his office. Marshall scooped Lydia into his arms and blew into her neck and made the sounds of pretend eating.
I'm already stuffed with blueberry muffin.
He set her down and did the same to Florence.
And a chocolate cake.
I used to consider it undignified, Judith said to Luke, her voice soft. And now, I love it. Her voice broke, and she had to blink her eyes to keep from crying. She was so emotional today, yet she couldn't help wishing her father had behaved like her brother. Is Edgar joining us? Doris asked, accepting a kiss from her husband.
So the lost sheep has finally come home, has he? Marshall asked dryly.
And he brought some answers to questions we've had. Luke pulled out a chair for Judith. We can discuss it once the girls have finished.
Ah,
Florence groaned.
They never let us hear about the interesting things,
Lydia said, her bottom lip stuck out in a pout. I heard once, Luke said, his tone teasing, that children should be seen and not heard. At the children's insulted expressions, he winked at them. That smells delicious, Mrs. Hauser, Edgar said as he entered the room. He strode to Marshall and extended his hand. The two men exchanged a meaningful glance, and Edgar took a seat. Where are you taking me today in this frigid weather? Judith asked Luke after the blessing on the food. To the Knox homestead.
What's there? Marshall asked.
Hank Knox is one of my scholars, Doris said. His grandmother makes the loveliest quilts. Her needlework is the finest I've ever seen. I suppose we're going to see needlework? Judith asked. Yes, and meet a woman who's the salt of the earth. He reached across the table and covered Judith's hand with his. You've been looking for other types of art to display for the Christmas fair, and she has some pieces you might want to include. Quilts weren't what she'd hoped to add to the list of displays, but she recalled the conversation they'd had the day before. Perhaps this was how he meant to help her to meet and learn the value of the people here. Because of the girls, they kept the meal conversation light. Doris then prepared to take Florence and Lydia to the nursery. Doris should stay for this, Luke said. All right, girls, Marshall said. You may sit in the parlor and read.
Yes, Daddy,
Florence said.
I get to read A Visit from St. Nicholas,
Lydia cried, running ahead. Florence abandoned all decorum and chased after her. Doris took her seat again and looked at Luke expectantly. It appears your uncle has a man here. From now on, we need to give the appearance you're living at the Lucky L, Luke said.
Now, wait just a minute,
Marshall said, his eyes flashing. Appearance, Luke stressed. He explained what they'd discussed at the sheriff's office. It's not just Doris who's in danger if this spy reports back to Lancaster. Indeed, Edgar said with a rush of emotion. We do not wish for this man to get wind that you're married, and I've been lying to your uncle. Doris had looked about to argue, but Luke shook his head. Are you willing to put Edgar's life in danger? He asked. No, of course not. I did not just get married so my wife can move back into her brother's house. Marshall looked at Doris with a tender expression. Especially now we're expecting. Oh, that's wonderful, Judith cried and hugged them both. Marshall shot Luke a worried look, and he understood. Since Marshall had already lost his first wife from complications following childbirth, he would be watching over Doris very carefully. It's fortunate the weather is so cold. Following Luke's suggestion, Judith said, sitting beside him again, Doris can go incognito whenever she leaves the house. Wearing work clothes and a good scarf, no one would be able to know who she is. In this dreadful cold, I seriously doubt this man would be lingering around the Circle B ranch when he appears to be targeting the Lucky L. It also begs the question of where he's been staying. Everyone started talking at once, and Luke reached over to take her hand. "Brilliant," he said. A peacefulness Judith hadn't felt in years filled her. Chapter 11.
"It looks like you've got your work cut out for you," Luke said, pulling out his pocket watch. "We'd best get going if I'm to get Judith back here and still leave in time to get to the Lucky L before dark. Sorry we can't help you clean up."
He rose and pulled Judith to her feet.
"Did you bring a chaperone, or shall I provide one?"
Marshall asked.
"I've got Junior keeping warm in the barn," Luke said.
"I'm not a child," Judith said, sounding irritated.
"Neither was I." Marshall shot her a knowing look, and she flushed. "But you'll also be with Luke, who seems to have a target on his back."
At the sound of bells, he said,
"It appears we have company."
Luke followed Judith to the window. It was Francis and Nick.
"Why are they here?" Luke asked, alarmed.
He stepped toward the door, but Doris had already opened it. She hurried the pair inside.
"What brings you to the Circle B?"
Luke asked, his breath slowing at their unconcerned expressions. "Doris's order for more cranberries came in, and we decided to drop it by," Francis said. "We tried to keep them warm, so I hope they're not frozen," Nick said as he handed the box to Marshall. "But it's that cold out there." "It's all right." Doris started opening the box. "Mrs. Hauser knows just what to do with them if they are. The girls will be delighted. We're going to display Judith's clever design at the Christmas fair." Luke glanced at her, and she ducked her head.
"I still haven't been able to see your garlands. I'd like to," Luke said softly to her. Raising his voice, he said to the others, "That's a great idea, but we need to get going."
"Where to?" Francis asked. Luke explained, and Nick's brows shot up. "I'd love to see some of those myself. My mother has the fastest quilting fingers you've ever seen, and always has something going. She gives out lots during the Christmas holidays. One thing I've missed since coming to Wyoming was my quilt. Maybe Mrs. Knox would let me hire her to make one for me." Nick glanced at Luke, his expression turning abashed. "We can go another day, sir."
"No, you can come." Luke glanced at Judith, and she nodded, though her expression had some reluctance. "Nick," he said, "when you get your sleigh, tell Junior to take mine back to the Lucky L. Best put on a hustle."
"Yes, sir." The young man gave a nod and hurried outside, with Francis right behind him. "I'll get my coat and hat then," Judith said. Luke followed her and pulled it from the hook before she could. He held it, and she turned and slid her hands into the sleeves. She was so beautiful. He wrapped his arms around her waist. She'd stilled at the embrace, and he buried his nose in her hair at the side of her neck. How he loved the smell of her. Without saying a word, he pressed a quick kiss to her neck and stepped back. Judith's cheeks had gone the brightest red he'd seen, and her hands were shaking as she tried to do up her buttons. "Don't forget your scarf," Luke said with a wink. Judith shot him a calculating glance. He was in for a bit of revenge, and he found himself looking forward to it. At the sound of sleigh bells pulling up to the front of the house, Luke opened the door, and the two of them stepped outside. With her arm through his, they made their way down the steps. Since Francis held the reins, Nick had jumped down to offer Judith a hand. "Do you wish to sit up front with Francis?" the cowman asked.
"No, you go ahead," Luke said, confident Judith wouldn't.
He helped her into the back seat and slid in beside her. She settled the blanket so it covered both of them. "That Junior is a thoughtful young man," she said, tapping the metal foot warmer filled with coals resting near their feet.
"He had a good teacher. Tom McDaniel is as good a foreman as I could want." Luke put his arm around Judith, and she cuddled next to him. It wasn't too bad sitting in the back seat while someone else drove. He lost himself in the quiet pleasure of sitting with the woman he was courting, until Frances raised her voice. "But I'm telling you," she said emphatically, "Uncle William is behind the attacks on Luke's cattle. And I'm telling you again, I don't disagree," Nick said just as firmly. "But before you can stop him, you have to figure out what he's after, because that man is after something." Luke leaned forward and asked, "Who told you your uncle was involved?" "No one," Frances said, a note of disgust in her voice. "We figured it out ourselves." She glanced back at them with a sly look before facing forward again. "How long have you known?" "We've had our suspicions for a while, but it wasn't until today, when Edgar returned, that we had confirmation." Luke watched the two. "What made you decide it was Lancaster?" "He's the only one who makes sense." Frances grumbled something under her breath that Luke couldn't understand. Nick shifted in his seat so he could see both Frances and Luke. "We've been trying to look at things the way Sherlock Holmes would." "Not that again." Luke leaned back in the seat with a huff. "Holmes has an orderly mind, and he picks up on details," Nick said, his tone defensive. "Don't you mean Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has an orderly mind?" Luke asked. "Sherlock Holmes isn't real." Frances muttered something again that sounded a lot like, "I told you he'd act like this." "Logic is logic, sir." Nick was obviously struggling to be patient, but Luke couldn't decide if it were with him or Frances. Nick said, "All we're trying to do is use the same logic demonstrated in the stories to help us search for clues. That's how we figured out it had to be William Lancaster behind the attacks." "I think they're clever," Judith said. "Tell us what you discovered." Luke decided to keep his mouth shut. "Everyone kept saying wolves were attacking the herd," Nick said. "My pa grew up hunting wolves. Now, it can be hard to tell the difference between a wolf print and a dog print, especially if it's a cross between a dog and a wolf." "And you could tell it was a dog?" Luke asked, finding himself interested after all. "Yes, sir. Now, that beast of a dog was as big as a wolf, so I understand how everyone looking at the tracks would assume it was one by looking at his paw prints." Nick was warming up to his topic, his hands moving for emphasis as he spoke. "But there's a difference in the shape of their paws. A dog's middle toe is bigger than the others. With wolves, they're the same size. Dogs also tend to drag their toenails when they walk, so their track is messier." "Tell him about the path," Frances said. "Dogs like to wander more," Nick said. "Pa always said wolves travel with a purpose. They're hunters and trackers. They don't waste energy. A wolf's prints go in an almost straight line, and the length of their stride is longer, too." "I'm impressed," Judith said. "Same here," Luke added. "Did you happen to find any man tracks?" "Sadly, no, though we saw some that looked like someone might have tried to disguise with branches." Nick shifted toward the front. "We might have been able to tell better if it hadn't been snowing every time there's been an attack, except that last one. I find that right suspicious." "We should have been talking to these two sooner," Luke whispered to Judith. "You're right." Frances turned onto a side road and pulled up to a small house. Smoke drifted from the chimney, so someone was home. Old Mrs. Knox didn't get out much, so Luke assumed it was her. "Let me make sure it's all right to visit." He jumped from the sleigh and hurried to the door. Before he could knock, it opened. "Well, Mr. Hamblin," Mrs. Knox said, "what a pleasant surprise. Come on in." "I'm not alone," he said quickly. "Do you mind having 4 visitors?" She sent a doubtful glance toward the sleigh, but nodded. It had started to snow again. "Mind if I put the sleigh in your barn?" Frances called. "Go right ahead." Mrs. Knox stepped back. "Hank's in there feeding the animals." Luke had returned to the sleigh and flipped a coin to his sister. "Tell the boy it's for watching the horses." He then helped Judith down. Frances and Nick drove away. "And who might you be?" the elderly woman asked once they were in the house. She eyed Judith with interest. "I'm Judith Breckinridge." She extended her hand. "Marshall is my older brother." "Well, my little house must seem like a back slum to a fine lady like you." "Not at all." Judith was glancing around the room. "Doris has been telling me what a gifted quilter you are, so Mr. Hamblin offered to bring me here so I could see for myself." At a light tap at the door, Luke opened it, and the other two came in with a gust of cold air. Mrs. Knox shivered. "We didn't mean to disturb you on such a bitterly cold day." Judith picked up a quilt by a rocking chair and gestured for the older woman to sit. With a bemused smile, Mrs. Knox did, and Judith settled the quilt on her lap. Luke had to bite back a smile. Doris was certainly rubbing off. "This is my kid sister Frances," Luke said, "and one of my hands, Nick Reynolds." "How do you do, ma'am?" The young man removed his hat and gave her a nod. "Are you here to see my quilts, too?" she asked, her tone now a little sarcastic. "Actually, I am." Nick explained about his wish for a nice quilt. He stepped up to one hanging on the wall. "This tumbling block pattern is the finest I've seen, if I say so myself." Judith stepped beside the cowman to get a closer look. The exact placement of the squares and the woman's color choices gave the quilt an optical illusion of depth. "Do you mind if I borrow your lamp?" Judith asked Mrs. Knox. "Go right ahead." Judith lifted it, and the better lighting showed how even and precise the woman's stitches were. It was almost as though it had been done by machine. "Mrs. Knox," Judith said, turning to face the woman, "we're having a Christmas fair next week, the day before Christmas Eve, and we're showcasing the talents of people in the area. If you would trust me to keep this quilt safe, I'd like very much to put it on display." "Talents?" "Yes, ma'am," Nick said almost reverently as he ran his hand over the fabric. "Though I must say I want to hire you before anyone else finds out what a gift you have." Judith was sure, as she returned the lamp to the table, that Mrs. Knox blushed. "Besides sharing talents, my hope is to expose the people of Lilac City to a little culture." Judith held her breath, hoping the woman wouldn't take offense. Mrs. Knox watched her for a few seconds before nodding her head. "I came from a well-to-do family, but I fell in love with a man who didn't. We came here 25 years ago with our boys to raise cattle. It was good for a few years until overgrazing and the harsh winters took its toll. But about 12 years ago, some of those Mormons showed up and started digging irrigation canals. With water and better management from the likes of your brother and Mr. Hamblin here, things have been improving." She let out a deep breath. "I would like very much to live long enough to see a bit of culture here. You may take my quilt." "Thank you so much, Mrs. Knox." Judith shook her hand. While Nick began a negotiation with the woman about his quilt, Judith moved to the wall. Luke helped her take it down. "It's beautiful," Frances said, examining it. "But I don't understand how anyone can sit in a chair long enough to do that kind of work." "You're young yet," Luke said, giving her shoulder a nudge with his. "When you're old enough to need to rest more often, you might want to take up something like this." "Just shoot me." She glanced out the window. "We'd best get going." The ride back wasn't as warm because the coals had cooled, but Judith didn't mind, not with Luke's arm around her. She kept her eye on the pair in the front of the sleigh. When they appeared completely engaged in a discussion, Judith shifted her face and nuzzled Luke's neck, meaning to tease him like he'd done to her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice gruff. When she pressed her lips to his chin, she'd expected him to lean away. Instead, his mouth found hers, and he pulled her close. Suddenly, Judith came alive in ways she'd never dreamed possible. She lost all sense of the surrounding cold, overcome by the sense of rightness his warmth brought her. Y'all better stop that," Nick said with a touch of humor. "I'd sure hate to have to report this to Mr. Breckinridge." "Don't forget who you work for, Reynolds," Luke said, straightening, mortified at his lack of control as much as having been caught at it. "I'll bet Mr. Breckinridge would hire me if you fired me in this situation." Nick grinned and faced the front again, while Frances laughed. "I can't believe I forgot myself. And I promised Marshall." Luke glanced at Judith and heaved out a breath. "You are a dangerous woman. Please don't do that again. I really am a man of my word, and your brother has a right to be protective." "I agree." Judith couldn't help feeling a little smug, but she was coming to understand just how powerful her attraction was to this man and, evidently, his to her. "Just remember, turnabout is fair play." "I will," he said, the words like they were a vow. Chapter 12. With school out until the beginning of the year, Doris had taken to visiting the homes of those in need of food or comfort. The only problem was she insisted on bringing Judith with her. It was fortunate Reverend Pierce was a widower, or his wife might have thought Doris was usurping her duties. "But I have so much yet to finalize for the Christmas fair," she said when Doris wanted Judith to accompany her to visit Mary Teague, whose baby was due any time. "It won't take long," Doris promised as she wrapped the scarf around her face that served to hide her identity as much as to keep her warm. "She sent word one of the cowboys dropped by a drawing for the displays. She said it's quite good, but she'd like your opinion on it." "I'll come then," Judith said with a sigh and left to get her coat and hat. The need to hide Doris's appearance whenever she went outside complicated and lengthened the visits. They'd drive into the Lucky L barn, and then she'd sneak into the house, change her coat so she could then appear to leave through the front door. Judith doubted they'd have gotten away with it if the weather had been milder. Once they finally arrived at the Teague home at the back of the dry goods store, Judith was ready to pull out her hair, worried about all she still needed to do for the fair. Luke teased her about putting too much store in doing things perfectly, but he didn't understand. He said he was willing to overlook her dishonored family, but what if it began to wear on him? What if it impacted his business? What she brought might not be enough to compensate. If she failed at something as simple as the Christmas fair, might he decide they didn't suit? When she spent time with him, Judith didn't doubt. At night, however, her dreams came as variations of the day Teddy had cast her aside. Only it was Luke who did it instead. Judith had fallen deeply in love with him. If he rejected her now, she would never recover. "Miss Doris!" 5-year-old Devon cried when he opened the door. "Are you helping your mother?" she asked, carrying a soup tureen into the house. "Yes, ma'am." He hurried over to where his siblings were playing, leaving the door wide open. Judith closed it. "How are you today?" Doris asked, setting the food on the table and going to the sofa where Mary lay. "It's been an uncomfortable morning." Her face pinched in pain, and she put her hands to her bulging abdomen. The woman seemed pale to Judith, the whiteness of her skin almost translucent. "Is the baby coming?"
Doris asked, her voice full of alarm. I'm afraid it's begun. My babies take a long time to come, so I haven't been worried about it.
Where's your husband? Judith asked.
Stephen had to go to Worland and won't be back until tomorrow.
Have you notified the doctor? Doris asked.
I tried this morning, a boy of about 7 said. He got called away to one of the farms near Greybull.
Judith's neck muscles tightened. She had no idea what to do for a woman giving birth, and Doris was little better.
We'll get word to the midwife, Judith said, her voice coming out a little breathy. I'd rather wait for the
Mary's words broke off, and she groaned, clutching her stomach.
You don't have a choice, Doris said firmly. If your baby is coming, you need someone besides myself and Judith to be here with you.
The youngsters now huddled together, watching the women. A chill ran down Judith's spine. Marshall's first wife never recovered from Lydia's difficult childbirth and had died a few weeks later. What if something went wrong with Mary's delivery? The children mustn't be here. Judith exchanged a wide-eyed glance with Doris. She would be the best with the children, but she would also be the most calming support for Mary. Judith realized that, as little as her experience was with children, it must fall on her. But what would she do?
Perhaps the hotel? Doris asked, squeezing out a cloth.
The hotel? Yes, they sold cookies there, and Florence and Lydia always looked forward to the treat.
Children, Judith said, where are your outdoor things? We should make a visit to the hotel to see what kinds of cookies they might have.
Cookie! The youngest child, a boy she guessed, must be about 2, repeated. All the children but the oldest jumped to their feet and hurried over to where their coats hung near the door. Matthew glanced worriedly at his mother, but Doris took his hand.
There's nothing you can do here, and Miss Judith will need your help with the others. With your father gone today, you're the man of the house. Are you up to it?
Matthew stood a little taller, and Judith found her eyes prickling at the boy's bravery. He ran to help the others get their coats on.
Mary, Judith asked, where in Worland is your husband going? Perhaps I could send him a telegram with word to come home right away. It's such a long trip. If he has to return early, he'll have to go again and could be gone over Christmas.
Judith exchanged glances with Doris again.
She shot the oldest boy a quick glance and then looked back at Judith, making a subtle motion like a salute. Was this a hint about a game Doris played with her scholars?
All right, Captain Matthew, Judith said, trying to sound like a general. Let's get your troops in order and head to the hotel for those cookies. He gave her a crisp salute, and she did her best to return it. Judith picked up the youngest child and settled him on her hip, while Matthew took the hands of his younger brother and sister. He led the way out the door, and she glanced over her shoulder to Doris and mouthed, "Thank you." As Judith was making her way with the children down the road to the hotel, she recognized one of the Lucky L sleighs coming toward them, with Luke at the reins. A sense of relief hit her powerful enough to bring tears to her eyes. She waved him over, though he was already slowing the team. "Well, what have we here?" he asked. "I was disappointed to find I missed you when you stopped by the house." "I'm leading the troops to the hotel, sir," Matthew said, his chest puffed with importance. "Would you like a ride?" Luke asked, already jumping down. The children all cried out in the affirmative. He took the little boy from Judith. "Look how much you've grown, Master Clarence." "As if you don't see him every week at church," Judith whispered to Luke as she helped little Ruth into the sleigh. "But they grow so fast." Luke winked, but looking at Judith more closely, he frowned. He didn't say more until the children were settled. As he held out his hands to lift Judith into the sleigh, he whispered, "Is something wrong with Mary?" "Her baby appears to be coming," Judith explained the problems. Luke turned thoughtful as he spread a blanket over Judith's lap. Once he'd taken the reins, he said, "After I drop you all off, I'll check with the sheriff.
I remember him saying his sister has some experience with birthings." "Will you be able to collect her?" Judith asked. Mary's pains were coming pretty quickly, and I'm worried Doris might be there with her by herself when it happens. "Haven't you noticed my sister is tougher than she seems?" Luke asked as they drove down the long street. "Yes, she is." Once again, Judith's inadequacies for the task weighed on her. "Oh, look, there's Abe," Luke shouted. "Hey, Sheriff!" The older man looked even more like a bear than usual, with his gray-streaked beard, fur coat, and hat. It was no wonder the man had never married, in spite of his good heart. "Miss Breckinridge," he said, nodding his head toward her after Luke pulled to a stop. "What can I do for you, Hamblin?" "Did I hear right that your sister has some experience with birthing babies?" Luke asked. "It seems Mary Teague is having hers, and both her husband and the doctor are out of town." The sheriff glanced at the children in the back of the sleigh. "My sister has delivered many babies. She's over at the bakery placing an order. Where are you headed with the kids?" When Judith explained, he said, "Babies take their time getting here. You could be there a long time. You have much experience with little ones?" She shook her head, and he chuckled. "I'm cold," little Clarence cried. "I'll get my sister," the sheriff said, already moving away. As Luke drove the remaining distance to the hotel, doubts began to assail Judith. She had no younger siblings, with the exception of her nieces, whom Judith had really only come to know since the summer and were quite self-sufficient. She had no experience with young children, or little boys who had always seemed like a different kind of creature altogether. Already Clarence's howls coming from the back of the sleigh were setting her nerves on edge, while Luke seemed completely unaffected. When he pulled to a stop, she didn't wait for him to help her down. She could feel the eyes of everyone around them staring at her, blaming her for the wailing child. There's that useless Judith Breckinridge. "It's all right. Let's get you inside where it's warm." She reached out her arms for the child, but he pulled away from her, continuing to sob. Back home, there would have been a nanny to pass a fussy child to. Judith had no idea what to do. "Hey, little man," Luke cried, coming around to stand beside her. He rubbed his stomach, his voice taking on a teasing tone. "Aren't you hungry for a cookie? Miss Judith isn't going to buy one for someone who's crying." Luke arched his eyebrows. "That means there will be more cookies for me." The little boy's tears stopped, his little face turning defiant. "You can't have my cookie." "Then we best get inside before they sell them all, hadn't we?" The child raised his arms, and Luke lifted him from the sleigh. Matthew followed and helped Devon down. Feeling completely inadequate, Judith helped Ruth down. By the time they got into the hotel, Luke was already settling the children at a table. "Let's have hot chocolate for everyone and a platter of cookies," he called to a waitress. Luke turned to Judith and said, "Did Mary happen to say where Steve was planning to stay in Warland?" Judith explained, and Luke shrugged, adding, "With her due so soon, that wasn't good planning. But what do I know? We'll handle the children together." "You're going to stay?" she asked, both relieved and worried. It would be lovely to spend time with him, but if he remained, he'd see for himself how incompetent she was. Luke, suddenly still, met her gaze. "Don't you want me here?" Judith sensed that if she told him she didn't want him to stay, he'd be hurt. "I was merely concerned about taking you away from your work," she said. "We'd enjoy your company." At least she hadn't lied. The youngsters would certainly prefer him to her. How did she explain without appearing pathetic? A man courted a woman because he was at least considering marriage. Luke especially would need more than a society wife such as she'd been trained to be. He'd have no use for a woman whose knowledge of children was little more than handing them off to servants. "I can tell something is bothering you,"
Luke said, taking her by the shoulders and staring into her eyes as though he could read her mind. "And we don't have time right this moment. Please promise me you'll tell me what it is." Judith's eyes suddenly filled with tears. When she tried to speak, her lips trembled. Why was it she seemed unable to control her emotions around him? Before she could turn away, Luke pulled her into his arms in spite of all the people watching. She allowed herself only a moment of the comfort. Blinking her eyes, Judith steeled herself and clutched at her usual rigid self-control. She stepped back. "Thank you. But you'd best hurry before someone steals your sleigh." She tried to make it sound like a joke, but based upon his wary expression, she'd been unsuccessful. He leaned closer to kiss the tip of her nose and hurried from the hotel restaurant. Taking a deep breath, aware of all the eyes on her, Judith turned and joined the children at the table. Clarence and Ruth were already fighting with each other, while Matthew and Devon valiantly attempted to pull them away from each other. Before entering the fracas, Judith reviewed in her mind the way Doris calmed Florence and Lydia. As Judith settled the children, she wondered how Mary controlled the energetic youngsters while helping in the store. It must be doubly difficult when it was too cold to play outside. By the time Luke returned, the children were calmly eating their cookies and sipping hot chocolate. He took the empty seat beside Judith and reached over to cover her hand with his cold one. "A hot chocolate will warm you up," she said, catching the attention of one of the waitresses who hurried over. "I'll have coffee and a piece of your apple pie," he said to Judith. "You got this herd whipped into shape just fine." "I can't take credit for it." Judith was sure Mary or Doris would have found a better way than bribery to control children. "The treats worked the miracle." "As they always do." He leaned back in his chair, his expression reminiscent. "When Maud was born, I had no experience around babies. She fascinated me, so tiny and fragile. She was fussy, too. Nurse was an older woman and had a hard time keeping the little thing calmed down. Lancaster didn't have much patience with crying babies. He got a little better when they could talk, and I'm sure he truly cared for the girls." Luke smiled, his expression smug. "It irked him no end that baby Maud preferred me." He had no patience with the child, yet was surprised when she wanted to spend time with the boy who did. "I never did understand the man. It took a few times of her reaching for me instead of him before he cottoned on. That was when he decided I needed to go away to school." Luke released Judith's hand and accepted the mug of coffee from the waitress. He took a sip and closed his eyes, a slow smile curving his lips. Judith found herself wishing she could feel the touch of them on her mouth. The room grew suddenly too warm. Luke opened his eyes then and met her gaze. "What? They make good coffee here. Almost as good as Abe does." At that moment, the door burst open and the sheriff stepped into the room. As soon as he saw them, he strode toward their table. "Well, young Teagues," he said, "you have a new and healthy little sister." "That was fast," Luke said, scooting over to make room for the sheriff. "Is Mary well?" Judith asked. "She's fine. Edith arrived in time to deliver the baby." Abe chuckled. "That Doris has a lot more guts than I ever gave her credit for. What a trooper. My sister said she jumped right in and did everything she was told. Said it was good training for when her own little one arrives." Both Judith and Luke glanced at each other in surprise. "I didn't know it was public knowledge." "It is a small town," Luke said with a shrug. Little Ruth's head was starting to droop, so Judith pulled her onto her lap. The child struggled and slid off. She ran to Luke, who lifted her. The little girl put her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. Judith looked down at the now cooling chocolate. Luke appeared to be one of those men who would be a natural father. While children didn't like her, he deserved a better woman than Judith. Chapter 13. Luke stepped into the community hall carrying 2 framed pictures. It'd taken some convincing to get Tom to agree to show his new watercolors, and even more to get Martha to let Luke bring them. She'd only agreed when he told her he'd have to bring them into town anyway to be framed. Ralph Jackson, the new woodworker, was already getting quite a reputation for his craftsmanship, and Luke had been lucky to be one of the first ones on the waiting list. He spotted Judith and hesitated. Things had been awkward between them since the day Mary Teague had given birth. He tried to talk to Judith about it, but she would change the subject to the fair. Luke was getting right tired of it. Andrew Pulsifer, the cowboy poet she was talking to, worked at the Lucky L. When word had gotten out, there had been a surprising number of applicants. A group of men from Cody had even tried to get in, but she'd been adamant the Christmas fair was for showcasing Lilac City residents. The other members of the Ladies' Improvement Society had agreed. The man was standing a mite too close to her. Did she not see it? Luke strode toward them. "Your piece is quite touching, and your use of language is beautiful," Judith was saying. "Your topic will be the best suited to lead into the children's nativity story."
Why, thank you, ma'am.
Pulsifer glanced at Luke, but continued.
I have some others you might like. I'd sure enjoy talking to you about them over dinner sometime.
"Sorry, Pulsifer," Luke said, stepping close to Judith. "I'm already courting Miss Breckinridge."
I might have known, the cowboy said with a sheepish grin.
He said to Judith,
"It's an honor to be on the program at all. My ma would be proud."
Pulsifer gave her a respectful nod and left. "I'm surprised he hadn't already heard you were courting me, since we're the talk of the town," Judith said, giving him a flacked look.
Why?
Was a simple hug in public what was bothering her? It appears there were a lot of tongue wagglers in the hotel dining room the other day. Her cheeks turned a pink he found particularly attractive. It wouldn't matter once they were married. Luke had made the decision to ask her the day before, but had wanted to wait until things settled down after the Christmas fair. "Let them waggle all they want. It's—" Luke's words broke off at the hint of hurt in her eyes. What else was going on in that beautiful head of hers? He leaned the picture frames against the raised platform that was serving as a stage and took her hands in his. "What's wrong?" Judith wouldn't look at him as she said, "I overheard more than one comment saying you could do better."
Old biddies.
"It wasn't women." She glanced at him then, her eyes too bright. "Let me catch a man saying—" "They're right, though." "That's for me to decide." Luke raised one of her hands and pressed his lips to it. "It's easy for people to judge when they don't know you." "You don't know me well enough yet." Judith's voice had turned bitter, and he wouldn't have it. "I'm pretty sure if I waited until I knew everything there was to know about you, I'd be an old man." Luke brought her hand to his chest. He hadn't intended to propose yet, but it'd been on his mind a lot. If he were honest, it'd been in the back of his mind from the first time he'd seen her nearly a year ago. The more time he spent with her, the stronger his feelings grew. She was a feisty delight. Until he'd begun their courtship, he hadn't understood how much he admired women who challenged him. And Judith Breckinridge challenged him, and so much more. "If you'll marry me," he said, "I'll have my whole life to learn about you." Judith gave a little gasp, her eyes wide. Her expression had turned vulnerable. "Luke, you have no idea how inadequate I am." Was this the conversation she'd promised they'd have the day at the hotel, but she'd since refused to discuss? Judith looked tired, like she hadn't been getting enough sleep. "I don't understand," he said.
You're an accomplished woman. How can you not be adequate?
I'm accomplished in all the wrong things. None of them have prepared me for the kind of life you have here." Her voice had taken on an edge, as though it brought her pain to say the words.
"You've been doing just fine."
Luke put his hands on her shoulders to keep from pulling her into his arms.
"I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I came out here with nothing more than an inheritance and a grand idea. I was a complete idiot. I'm surprised Tom stuck with me as long as he did, but he must have seen something in my potential. He helped to make me a competent rancher."
"You are so much more than competent." Judith reached up and cupped his cheek. "I've found my brother to be an exceptional rancher and businessman, and you're his equal."
"Thank you. But please don't change the subject. We're talking about you, Judith."
"I want to marry you." Luke started to pull her closer, but she resisted, dropping her hand. "I have little experience with children, Luke. I'm afraid I have no motherly instincts. I'd be a terrible mother." Judith took another step away, but he captured her hands again.
"The good Lord didn't give us a book of instructions, sweetheart."
At his endearment, she winced, but let him draw her near.
"Just look at my sisters. They're as different in temperament as women could be. I've mentioned my mother. She started out with a son and didn't have another child until years later when Maud was born. Placid Doris came along next, and I'll bet my mother imagined she'd figured it all out."
"And then Frances was born," Judith said with a dark chuckle.
"Exactly. I was here when Florence was born. Marshall would never admit it now, but he was scared to death. He didn't know what he was doing either, and he mentioned to me more than once how much he worried about turning into a father like yours."
"He could never be like Father," Judith said with disgust. "But if I were to marry you, you'd miss out on an opportunity to find a woman worthy of you."
"Now that's it, Judith Breckinridge,"
Luke said, his muscles quivering with a desire to punish the people who'd beaten her down.
"I will not stand back any more and listen to you disparage yourself."
He leaned in until they were almost nose to nose.
"You are an incredible woman, and I love you." Miss Breckinridge, are you all right?" a man asked from the side.
Luke turned to scowl at James Harkins, the owner of the local newspaper.
"Do you mind, Jim?" Luke growled. "I'm trying to get this woman to say she'll marry me, but she's being pig-headed." "Well, you shouldn't try to force her," Mayor Phelps said, coming with his wife to stand next to Harkins.
"He's right, Mr. Hamblin," Mrs. Phelps said, and gently pulled Judith away. "Are you all right, dear?" His heart aching, Luke watched Judith move away from him. It was almost as though she'd put a wall between them. The people were right. What if he'd been pushing all this time, but she didn't return his affection to the same degree? Accepting defeat, he took a step back. If Judith really didn't want him, he wouldn't push her. That was something her father would have done. "Where do you want me to hang these pictures, Miss Breckinridge?" His words came out as stiff as his posture. With pale cheeks, Judith glanced at the others and indicated a wall that still had some room on it. Luke turned around without a glance back and strode over there. As he hammered a nail into the wall, he wondered when she'd decided they wouldn't suit. Not that it mattered. He'd never force a woman to do anything she didn't want to, especially marry him. When Luke had finished and made sure the watercolors were even, he went in search of other work to do. With so many of his men participating, he couldn't leave. More people had arrived and were setting up their displays on the tables. It was a good thing the Reverend had suggested they cut out wooden rounds that could be set on the old logs they'd used for seating in the church before they'd purchased pews last fall. It appeared the ladies of the Improvement Society had gathered tablecloths to spread over them. It looked quite nice. Nowhere in the room could he find Judith. It didn't matter that it was even colder outside with twilight approaching. Luke needed a walk. Judith scurried around the room, answering questions and taking care of minor emergencies, aware of the growing number of curious glances. What must Luke's declaration have looked like to everyone? She cringed every time his words came to her mind, which was often. It was the most embarrassing and charming thing a man had ever done for her. Luke had said he loved her. He wanted to marry her. She mustn't let it distract her. Judith pulled out her list. She must keep busy. The sheriff and Charles had taken responsibility for running the turkey shoot. From all accounts, the event had gone well. One of the older cowhands had suggested they bring in some turkeys to shoot, of all things. The ladies of the society had made it clear they didn't want dead birds as part of their Christmas fare. Instead, the men had agreed to shoot at turkey-shaped targets instead, with one live bird the grand prize. The winner would eat well for Christmas dinner. She wondered if they would ever help these people understand appropriate behavior, like making very public declarations of love and marriage proposals. If he had done such a thing back in New York, members of high society would have punished them for the display of affection the same way they had a crime. He and she would have been socially ostracized. For the first time since Teddy had cast her aside and walked away, Judith found she didn't care what any of the people in New York thought. Her spirits lifted. The first of the musical numbers would begin soon, and the room was filling up with people looking forward to entertainment and warmth. At the suggestion of Edith, families wishing to sell small items had been given booths near the door. Judith was sure many of the items on display would also be sold. A permanent art center in Lilac City would be a lovely legacy. It wouldn't have to be large, but the broad selection of items today was evidence of the many talented people who resided here. She scanned the room, struck by the power of it. It was as though the Lord had opened her eyes and a sense of humility settled on her. These people worked hard, giving most of their energy and strength to survival. Yet through it all, they still created this beauty. Pride at what they'd accomplished swelled in her chest, and a lump formed in her throat. Mr. Pulsifer's words echoed in her mind. Dirty cowboy? What stuff and nonsense. Judith wanted to share what she'd come to understand with Luke. She glanced around the room. Had he left after hanging the pictures? Then she recalled the expression on his face. He declared his love for her, and she'd been so consumed by her own imperfections, she hadn't even considered how her hesitation might make him feel. Had Luke taken her response as rejection? When he'd pressed her for an answer, Judith's doubts had overwhelmed her. She hadn't been able to think. Then those people had appeared, and she hadn't been able to speak. His words echoed in her mind. Where was he? "What are you frowning at?" Marshall asked from behind. Startled, Judith clutched her hands to her chest and spun to face him. "Is it because Luke proposed to you?" "How can you know that?" Her brother shot her a disbelieving look. "You had witnesses, dear sister, and stories always grow the more they're passed around. If I thought he'd really tried to force himself on you, I'd kill him." "Don't be ridiculous," Judith said, irritated at the gossip mongers. "You know perfectly well Luke would never do that." "Yes, I do. I've already given my blessing. If Luke proposed today, why are people not congratulating you?" Marshall glared at her. "Please don't tell me you agreed to the courtship but then turned him down." "Of course I didn't turn him down," Judith said, putting on a hard smile. "Even I wouldn't give a man false expectations." "What does that mean?" Her brother studied her, his eyes narrowed. "I am the daughter of Martin Breckinridge, aren't I?" Fighting against the stinging in the back of her eyes, Judith lifted her chin. The too familiar manner she'd developed for protection back in New York slipped into place. "Oh, Juicy," Marshall said, using his childhood nickname for her, and putting a hand on her cheek. "Please don't look like that again." "What are you afraid of?" Judith told him all she'd said to Luke. He doesn't need a high society lady who's had servants to do everything for her and a nanny to care for the children. Judith's voice broke the last word. "Ah," Marshall nodded. "You've been a mess ever since you visited Mary Teague the day she had her baby. You don't have anything to worry about. You already know how to be a good mother. Our own showed you how to love and protect. If you marry Luke, you won't have anything to worry about." "But how does one care for so many children?" Judith rubbed her temples, a headache building there. "Does Luke have children I'm not aware of?" Judith scowled at her brother. "Unlike Doris's situation, where she inherited 2 children by marrying me," Marshall said, humor touching his voice now. "You and Luke would start your family with a newborn and not 4 children. And they would be yours. I have 2 of my own, whom I manage quite well. And I can't handle Stephen Teague's children." Her brother shook his head. "I can see your New York finishing school didn't prepare you to be a rancher's wife, but they did teach you how to learn. Juicy, you'll excel at it just as you do everything you put your mind to." Judith dared to let herself believe. "Have you seen Luke?" "That's my girl." Marshall pointed to the back of the hall. "The last I saw, he was heading outside. He won't leave, not with some of his men performing. Be sure to wear your coat." He gave her a gentle push in the direction of the door. Assuring herself her brother wouldn't lie, Judith gathered her coat and scarf to protect her ears and face. She didn't have time for a hat. She had to find Luke and tell him she'd marry him. As she walked to the door, Frances approached with narrowed eyes. She carried the rifle she'd used earlier to participate in the turkey shoot, her posture stiff. "What are you playing at?" the young woman asked, planting herself in front of the door and looking very much like she wanted to use the rifle on Judith. "I have no idea what you mean." She tried to brush past Frances, but she shifted to block the way outside. "We saw you kissing my brother, and now you won't marry him?" "Whoa there, Frances," Nick put himself between them. "You ought to know better'n to buy into the local gossip. Even without meaning to, people manage to twist things they've heard. That's why I'm asking Judith to tell me what happened." Frances moved next to Nick, her head tilted and one brow arched. "This is not a discussion I wish to have with you." Judith tried to move past them. "Not so quick," Frances began. "Fine." Judith matched the young woman's posture and met her gaze. "I'm trying to go outside to finish the conversation your brother and I were having when we were so rudely interrupted. Now, do you mind?" "I told you so," Nick muttered, and Frances glared at him. He said to Judith, "Go ahead." "I'll let you go, but I'm standing right here by this door. If I'm not happy with how my brother looks..." Frances shot Judith a warning glance. The humor of the situation struck her, and she smiled. "I hope we'll all be happy." Chapter 14. Luke pulled up his collar. The trees near the back of the community hall provided a buffer for the wind that had kicked up. It had a bite to it, so it looked like they were likely to get more snow. The year had turned out to be nothing like his previous ones. It had started out well. Last spring, he'd been excited beyond comprehension to receive the first telegram saying his sisters would be coming to live with him. What a reunion that had been. Then Marshall had had one of his own, with Judith joining him. Luke started to pace to keep his feet from going numb. That woman. She hadn't lacked confidence when she'd agreed to his suit. Had he been cocky that she'd returned his feelings? He had some experience with women, mostly before he'd come out west. He'd met a few society ladies to whom flirting was a way of life, but he'd never have guessed Judith might be one of them. When she'd responded to his kiss the way she had, he'd assumed it had meant something. The sound of a twig cracking in the nearby brush startled him. He peered into the fading light, but shadows made it difficult to see if someone were standing there. The privy was on the other side of the building, and he'd seen people going in and out that door all day. He hoped one of the children hadn't gotten confused after a visit to the outhouse and wandered off. "Hello?" Luke called, listening for movement. Was that a whimper? With the wind, he couldn't tell. He took a few careful steps in the direction of the trees. Another low sound came from the underbrush, almost like a muffled cry. A chill ran down Luke's spine. Was it a premonition or only the wind? "Is anyone there?" A low growl made Luke's skin crawl. He moved back, his hand automatically reaching for his gun. It wasn't there, of course. He'd left it hanging with his gun belt back at the ranch. He shouldn't have needed it at a cultural event.
"Not so fast,"
a deep-accented voice said. A large, bear-shaped form seemed to appear out of the trees carrying something. On each side, 2 sets of eyes glowed in the light of the dying sun. As they walked forward, he recognized the creatures for what they were. Huge dogs. One had a similar look to the beast Tom had killed. Something in the man's arms moved, and Luke recognized it. Little Devon Teague. The child's eyes were huge. "Put the boy down," Luke said, keeping an eye on the animals.
"Your man killed my dog."
The man's heavy accent made a mess of the words, but the menace in them was unmistakable. "Your dog killed some of my cattle," Luke said. "The child has nothing to do with it."
"Cattle were my job. Kill my dog. You make it personal."
"Well, killing my cattle made it personal to me." Luke took on the placating voice he used with an angry guest. "This is between us. Let the boy go." A whimper came from Devon, but a sharp command from the man silenced the child. How was Luke to get the boy away? Distraction? "How much is William Lancaster paying you?"
"Much money. He only want herd ruin, so sisters go to him."
A glint of white appeared in the man's beard. Was he grinning?
"Kill you. Make better for him."
Devon whimpered again. Luke took a step forward, but one of the dogs snarled. The menacing sound made the hair on the back of his neck stand up and silenced the boy. The man lifted a hand like he was preparing to give a command, but the door behind Luke opened and light spilled into the area. He stiffened, sending up a silent prayer that no one would be hurt. "Luke?" At Judith's tentative voice, his heart lurched into his throat. His instincts to protect pulled him in 2 different directions. He raised one hand before him and the other to signal her to stay, but she gasped. "How dare you!" she cried, rushing forward. "Unhand that child at once!" Everything seemed to happen at once. The man threw Devon to the ground at the same time he gave a command in another language. The dogs leaped into motion. One charged at Judith, while the other came at Luke. Judith threw her arms up with a scream. The beast hit her, and the cry turned into an oof with the impact. Lights flashed in the corners of Luke's eyes. Then the other dog's paws hit his chest. They crashed on the snow. There were 2 sharp cracks in quick succession. The beast collapsed on him. "No!" the man roared. "Stay right where you are, mister," Frances cried in her most menacing voice. "And she ain't alone," Nick's voice growled. Then there were many voices all around them. Luke shoved the beast off and struggled to his feet. "Judith! Devon!" he cried, pushing past the people, scanning the tree line. Luke found her on the ground by the boy whom she cradled against her chest as he cried. He appeared to have just been frightened. A knot formed in Luke's throat. What if she'd been killed? A sense of loss not experienced since the death of his mother struck him with such force his knees turned weak. But Judith wasn't dead. He staggered to her and dropped to his knees to put his arms around the two of them. "Judith!" Marshall called, running to them, Stephen Teague beside him.
"Daddy!"
Devon sobbed, extending his hands to his father, who took him into his arms. People crowded around them. "He's getting away!" Frances cried, followed by the sound of gunfire. "Hey, I was going to shoot him."
"Not your job, Frances. Now you folks get back inside. Where's the doctor?"
Sheriff Vosburgh shouted as he strode to the man's prone form.
"Is that blood?"
Marshall asked, his voice choking. "How badly are you hurt?" Luke asked, pulling Judith to her feet.
"Did that beast bite you?"
Still trembling, she looked down at her coat. The green now had dark splotches running down her left side. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she swayed with dizziness. "Let me see," Edith Vosburgh said, pushing her way past the crowd. "Are you hurt?" Judith hurt everywhere, but nowhere specifically. "It must be the dog's blood. What about you, Luke?" Everyone turned their eyes to him now, while Edith took Judith's arm. "We need to get the two of them inside and in better light."
"Where's the doctor?"
Marshall asked, his voice now indignant.
"He's trying to save that German fellow who had the dogs," Charles said. "The sheriff's gone inside to oversee the surgery."
Luke put his arm around Judith's shoulders and offered her support as they headed back into the building. Still wobbly, she needed it. A flash of irritation struck her. After all their work, that terrible man and his beastly animals had turned the Christmas fair into chaos.
"It's not at all the proper atmosphere for the Christmas story," she complained.
Mr. Teague shifted to look back at her, Devon in his arms. The child raised his hand to her. Judith smiled at him. Then Mary was pulling him from his father, her eyes brimming with tears. "If you gentlemen will take Mr. Hamblin to another room to be examined for injuries, I will take Miss Breckinridge with me," Edith said in the same commanding voice her brother used when he was ordering people around as the sheriff. "We're coming with Judith," Frances said. Doris and Maud nodded their heads. "Fine." Edith led the way inside. Judith's body had begun to calm, but her tears began. She said nothing, moisture running down her cheeks, as the ladies helped to remove her coat. They examined her thoroughly, asking if anything hurt.
"I feel as though I took a fall from a horse," she said with a sniff,
and Doris handed her a handkerchief. "I'd say a small horse did fall on you," Frances said, and her voice turned proud as she said, "And I put that beast down. Nick got the one on Luke."
"You shot the dog?"
"I sure did. He looked like he was about to go for your throat."
"He was."
When the shaking began again, Judith took a deep breath to calm herself. They had survived. "Your coat must have protected you," Edith said. "There are some tears in it and only a little blood on your dress."
"Is there an apron I can borrow to cover it?" Judith asked.
"Aren't you going home?" Maud asked.
"The Christmas fair isn't over."
Judith glanced around the room that had been serving as a kitchen.
"Doris's scholars have been working all month on this program, and tomorrow is Christmas Eve. We must not disappoint them." Are you sure? Doris asked, looking uncertain. We can't end the evening with this. We must have the story of the birth of the Prince of Peace, Judith said. I agree, Frances said firmly. We need to give everyone something happy to leave the fair with. I'll tell the children, Doris said, turning to leave. Mr. Pulsifer must read his cowboy poetry piece first, though, Judith called, beginning to feel more like herself as she gave instructions. That will help calm everyone. Now let me find an apron. The women left her, and Judith took a few minutes to compose herself. She stepped out of the kitchen area. She found Luke and Marshall waiting. Doris said you're unhurt? Her brother asked. Do you doubt her? Judith patted his cheek while she took Luke's hand with her other. Doesn't she need your help with the scholars? Will Devon be able to perform? That little boy is one tough kid, Luke said. He didn't even wait for Doris to ask, Marshall said with a grin. The little man marched right up to her and insisted he was able to fulfill his duty. Pulsifer is ready to begin his piece, Luke said. Excellent. I've been looking forward to hearing him recite it. Judith took a step forward, but Luke pulled her back. I love you. He cupped her cheek and pressed his forehead to hers. When I saw that dog jump on you, Luke coughed. I was afraid I'd lost you. Don't make me start crying again, she said, blinking her eyes against the burning. All right. Luke lifted his head and met her gaze, his expression soft and loving. But we still have unfinished business to discuss. Yes, we do. Now come. With emotion threatening to burst from her chest, Judith began towing him toward the performance area. Chapter 15. They took their seats in the back of the large room, and Luke wondered briefly what had happened to their attacker. It was a shame the doctor and those helping him were going to miss the end of the program. Folks had to squeeze in on the benches, and many still stood. Judith had been right. Pulsifer's poem about missing family while out on the range was perfect to lead into the children's Christmas story. As the scholars gathered, Luke scanned the benches. With his arm around Judith's waist and his sisters sitting on his other side, a lump formed in Luke's throat. Even when he'd been sent away to school, he'd still been a part of a family. It had only been when their father had forbidden their communication with Luke that he'd given up. After moving to Wyoming after his mother's death, he'd tried to accept the loss of his family. Then, 2 years ago, Frances's first letter had arrived. It had truly been a gift. Like the little family being portrayed on the stage, he was grateful for this blissful moment. He accepted that difficult things were yet to come. He wasn't in heaven yet, after all. Luke tightened his arm around Judith, and she scooted a little closer. He wanted to shout his love to the world. The corner of his mouth twitched, in a very public way. Little Devon Teague did a fine job as one of the 3 kings, placing a gift in front of the baby Jesus with pride. The boy didn't look nervous at all. Luke could only hope he wouldn't suffer from bad dreams tonight. Luke had expected the baby in little Florence Breckinridge's arms to be a doll, until the audience began to clap at the conclusion. The bundle in her arms began the wail of a newborn. Florence shot a worried glance to the side, where Mary Teague was hurrying over to take the babe. To begin, the mayor shouted above the din of chatting people, I'd like to thank our scholars for their magnificent portrayal of the Christmas story. Let's give them another hand for a job well done. When he was able to quiet everyone again, he continued, I would like to call our first Christmas fair a success, and I hope we can count on the fine women of the Ladies' Improvement Society to continue it in future years. See what you did? Luke whispered in Judith's ear. I'll now turn the time over to Mrs. Teague.
the mayor said, when the applause had died down again. She stepped forward. "We've already had enough excitement for today, and I promised my husband I would only stay a few minutes." Mary looked lovingly at Steve, who stood near the door holding the baby. "As I'm sure you can guess, it's no small feat to pull off an event like this, trust me. There's more to it than simply making a list of the events. It takes people anticipating what could go wrong and being prepared for it." "Like a dog attack?" one of the cowhands called out, setting some in the crowd to chuckling, while others hissed. "I have no idea how anyone could have anticipated that." Mary's face had gone pale at the reminder, and she glanced to where Devon stood with his father. "I wanted to acknowledge the hard work of our volunteers and, even more, to honor one lady I could always count on to do anything and everything I needed her to do. She was full of ideas on how to make things run more smoothly. Her insight and organizational skills are the finest I've seen." Mary glanced at the mayor with a sly grin. "If we ever need someone else to help run this town, I know just who to suggest running, and that is Miss Judith Breckinridge." Judith blinked as the crowd began to applaud. A few people were slow to start, but they finally joined, most with enthusiasm. She stared out at the throng, struck by how many of them she had become acquainted with. Mrs. Knox grinned at Judith. She'd heard the woman didn't often leave her home and was glad her quilt had won a prize. "Go to Mary," Luke said. "But everyone in the society worked hard," Judith argued. "I don't deserve special recognition." "Don't be an idiot." Frances took one of Judith's arms and Maud the other, as though they intended to drag Judith up to the stage. Rather than create a scene, she let them pull her to her feet. Pain at the movement made her groan, and Luke was on his feet in an instant. He groaned, too. "I guess we're both a little stiff after hitting the ground so hard." He offered her his arm. "I hope I don't look like an old woman walking up there." Judith slid her arm through his, and they slowly made their way to the stage. She was grateful there were only 2 steps. "You're the one who made this happen," Judith said as she stepped beside Mary. "We made it happen," Mary said, her voice loud and firm. "We and the people of Lilac City. But it would not have been this grand affair if not for your dedication and perseverance. On behalf of the Ladies' Improvement Society, we thank you." The mayor's wife stepped forward and handed a lap desk to Mary, who, in turn, held it out to Judith. She stared at the beautiful carving of the local mountain range. "Mr. Hamblin mentioned your lap desk was looking the worst for wear after putting in so much work on behalf of our Christmas fair, so we commissioned a new one for you." Mary smiled. "We hope you'll use it as you continue to bring culture and, need I say, fun to Lilac City." Once again, the crowd broke out with enthusiastic applause, this time including a few cheers from the cowhands. "There's one more thing," Luke said, stepping to Judith. Her heart raced at the determined expression on his face. He took the box and handed it back to Mary. Did he mean to have that interrupted discussion now? Wasn't that just like him? Luke took her hand and brought it to his chest before turning to face the crowd. "Many of you may have heard I've been courting Miss Judith. Today I told her I love her and wish to marry her." Judith closed her eyes, her cheeks flushing. He was really doing it. "Believe it or not, she thinks she's not good enough for me." Luke almost shouted the words, his tone rich with disbelief. "What about you all?" "Say yes, Miss Judith," Nick Reynolds shouted. "Say yes." When others joined in, she opened her eyes. The men had taken up a chant of "say yes," and the ladies were adding their voices. Many in the crowd were clapping their hands and stomping their feet. Judith met her brother's gaze. He watched her expectantly.
She raised her free hand, and the crowd quieted. She swallowed and said, "This was not the atmosphere I'd intended following the Christmas story." Some people laughed, and others groaned. "Are you going to put the man out of his misery?" Marshall called. Judith looked at Luke in his delicious dark eyes. "I love you, and I can't live without you," he said, his expression open and vulnerable. "Will you please marry me?" "I love you too." She took a deep breath and said, "If you're willing to live with my failings, I'll gladly marry you." The people started cheering and hats went flying into the air. Luke pulled her into his arms. "I'm not exactly perfect either, sweetheart." His lips met hers, and he kissed her, right there before God and everyone.
Epilogue. Frances slowly sat up in her bed on Christmas morning and rubbed her eyes. When awake, she usually managed not to think of her father, but this morning she couldn't help it, not with the memory of the dream so vivid. In it, the four of them had been gathered around the dinner table as they had that evening last March. Just as he had then, her father looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in years. There'd been such love and pride in his expression that her breath had hitched. He'd handed her a letter of acceptance to the music school with a date in the fall. Her classes would have begun 3 months ago. The too familiar sense of loss nearly overwhelmed Frances, and her throat tightened, a knot of pain making her rub her chest. She refused to think about either the music or her father. As she moved her legs to the edge of the bed, another bit of the dream came to her. Father hadn't looked well for a couple of weeks before his collapse, but had eaten fairly well that night. A sense she sometimes got when things didn't quite add up hit her as forcefully as the images in the dream had. Something was wrong, and her mind was trying to tell her what. She must pay attention. Frances stilled and closed her eyes, allowing memories of her father to flow through her. They began as little snippets of things she'd overheard. He'd barely been able to be in her presence the last 2 years, so she'd taken to eavesdropping whenever she could, just to hear his voice. She'd found if she quoted Shakespeare, he would stay at the dinner table longer. But toward the end, that hadn't worked. Even now, anger made the muscles in her neck tighten. Something niggled at her memory, and Frances forced herself to relax and not let anger distract her. She allowed the recollections to flow through her mind. Father had been talking in his office to someone she hadn't liked, so she hadn't stayed near the door very long. Her gut told her it was important to remember who it had been. She took a deep breath, tightening and then relaxing her muscles. The memory of the man's voice became stronger, louder. Uncle William. Why had he been there? The brothers couldn't abide each other's company and rarely saw each other. If it hadn't been for Aunt Anne, Frances doubted they would have spoken at all. The memory tugged at her again, and she gave it her full attention. They'd been having words of some kind. The threatening tone of her uncle's voice had drawn her back to the door. Uncle had been demanding her father give him something, but he'd refused. When her uncle had stormed from the office, he'd caught her by surprise. She'd had to scramble to hide behind the statue and pillar in the nearby alcove to avoid being seen. Her mind shifted back, and she made the connection. Her father's stomach complaints had begun the next day. Coincidence? At first, the doctor had suggested it was an ulcer of the stomach. He'd provided Father with powders and counseled him to ease back on his responsibilities. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, his health had rapidly declined until he'd collapsed at dinner. The doctor had declared it a heart attack brought on by stress. Frances popped open her eyes, a chill running down her spine. She'd read more than one newspaper article where people who had ingested a poison and been thought to have died of a heart attack. Something clattered against her bedroom window, startling her from her thoughts. With a pounding heart, she hurried to it and pulled back the curtain. Nick stood there in early morning light. He raised his hands in disbelief. She opened the window. "I'll be right down to help with the feeding," she called, shivering against the cold.
"We're already done, so take your time."
Nick grinned.
"I wanted to give you a hard time about sleeping in."
"You coming to breakfast?"
"Course."
"Good. I need to talk to you about something." Frances closed the window and let the curtain fall back into place. She had a lot to consider.
"I can't believe you were able to get your hands on this so quickly,"
Nick said, hurrying to the wagon. Where he'd come from in Texas, they hadn't had much snow. Definitely not enough to make it worth the effort to put sleigh runners on a large wagon. "I didn't think it was going to make it here in time," Luke grinned. "This will be the perfect Christmas present for Frances. Can you run and get some more help? This thing's a bear to lift, even with the legs off it."
"Sure thing, boss."
Nick didn't have far to go because several of the other hands had come outside to see what Luke was up to.
"Throw some more dirt on the walkway," Tom called. "We don't want to slip carrying this to the house."
"Nick, you come help lift it off," Luke said. "I trust you not to drop it."
"Yes, sir."
He hurried over. He'd heard of a Steinway before, had brushed it off as one of those fancy and expensive things the folks back east liked to brag about owning. He'd been with Luke when he'd placed the advertisement in papers from larger cities between Billings and Salt Lake City. Judith had said a Steinway could take a year to build. No wonder they cost so much. Luke had gotten lucky to find a used one in Cheyenne. They carefully moved it into the parlor where they put on the legs and positioned it near the Christmas tree. Nick kept glancing at the door, expecting Frances to come down the stairs and catch them at it. But she didn't. He came to stand by Luke and said, "This is nothing like my mother's upright. These things certainly deserve the name grand."
"I imagine all of you are hungry for breakfast," Mrs. McDaniel said from the doorway. "I've got it set up on the sideboard."
She shot a concerned glance at the stairs.
"I thought Frances would be down by now." "I think she's probably missing her father," Nick said, shooting an awkward glance at his boss, whose expression had darkened at the mention of the man. "Ah, that makes sense," Mrs. McDaniel said. "It is her first Christmas without him. Well, let's bless the food so you men can eat."
Once Luke had, the cowhands hurried into the dining room. Nick held back. He wanted to see the look on Frances's face. She might even be willing to play something. She'd only mentioned once she could play, but her expression had turned so sullen he'd never dared to bring it up again. He'd assumed it was because she hadn't liked to play and had considered it one of those womanly things she'd been forced to learn and hated on principle. "Any sound of her moving up there?" Luke asked as he returned from the dining room.
"There she is now," Nick said as her booted feet appeared at the top of the stairs.
He'd recognize the sound of her footstep anywhere. Luke let out a deep breath. It was the first sign the man was nervous. Was he worried his sister might not like his gift?
"You okay, sir?" Nick asked.
"She's either going to love it or hate it and make our lives miserable."
"Nah,"
Nick watched as she came down the stairs.
"Frances is opinionated and not afraid to speak her mind, but she's got a good heart. She'd never punish anyone for such a thoughtful gift."
"I hope you're right." "What are you two standing like that for?" she asked with a frown. "I'm waiting to show you your Christmas present." Luke extended his hand.
"Now?"
Her posture had turned wary. "Now." He took her hand and gently led her into the parlor. With a gasp, Frances came to an abrupt halt. Nick nearly ran into her back. She dropped her brother's hand and dashed to the piano, running her fingers over the wood. She looked up, her eyes glistening. Then she launched herself into Luke's arms with a sob. Nick took a step back. Frances hated to cry, especially where everyone could see. Whenever one of the men suggested she might be about to cry, she'd go after him with her gun. It was only new guys now who dared to pull it. Yet here she was, crying like a baby. "Do you like it?" Luke asked.
I love it.
She released him and spun on Nick.
If you dare say anything, not a word.
He raised his arms like he was being held up.
I promise. You going to play something?
Don't be an idiot. Even shifting it a little requires a professional tuning. Frances went back to it and sat on the bench. Nick expected her to lift the fallboard and expose the keys, but she only rested her hands in her lap and stared at it. "Judith mentioned it'd have to be tuned, so I have someone coming from Billings tomorrow." Luke came to stand beside her. "I didn't know what music you might like, but we can order whatever you want. For right now, it's all here." Frances pointed to her temple. "I can't thank you enough for this, Luke, but it's too much. Consider it 10 years' worth of birthday and Christmas presents." "You'd best come eat before it's gone," Mrs. McDaniel said, peeking in. Luke bent over and kissed his sister on the temple before striding from the room. Watching her gaze lovingly at the piano, Nick experienced a twinge of jealousy. His thoughts drifted back to the Christmas fair, where Reverend Pierce had approached him and asked his age.
23, Parson. Why?
"I've recently talked with Mrs. Champion."
I ain't heard of her. She must be new in town.
Nick had wondered what the parson was leading up to. "She's starting up a business," Reverend Pierce had rubbed his jaw. "She's a matchmaker and will be bringing in some mail-order brides." Nick had taken a step back.
Why are you telling me that?
"Well, a young man your age ought to consider getting married and settling down." With a glance at Frances, the parson had patted Nick on the shoulder and said, "Some women just have no desire for matrimony." Watching her now, Nick wished she'd looked at him like she did that dang piano. He heaved out a breath. No matter what the parson had said, Nick didn't want any other woman. Either he convinced Frances to marry him when she was ready, or he'd stay single.
Thank you for listening to A Lady for Luke. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to know when new audiobooks or other fun videos are available.
This has been A Lady for Luke, Lilac City novella series, written by Donna K. Weaver, narrated by Vicki Pierce. Copyright 2019 by Donna K. Weaver. Production copyright by Donna K. Weaver.